They say humanity once ruled the stars, not by faith, nor by blade, but by brilliance. Before fire fell from the heavens and the warp screamed open its teeth, we were architects of galaxies, not gods, but dangerously close. At the height of the age of technology, known now only in relic, ruin, and whispered prayer, mankind stretched across the stars like a tide without end. We seeded millions of worlds. We bent gravity. We sculpted continents. Planets bloomed under our touch, reshaped by engines of such mastery that today they are barely comprehensible. Worlds that were once barren now grew crops under artificial suns. Cities reached into orbit, tethered by columns of light. We did not worship gods. We built them from circuits and steel. We walked side by side with machines that thought faster than any man. The men of iron, as they were later called, served as tireless companions, soldiers, builders, pilots. They were logic made fleshless, and we trusted them too much. Warp travel, once the dream of mad philosophers, had become common. The Imperium, dangerous, unstable, and vast, was mapped, charted, tamed. At the heart of this miracle was the navigator gene, a mutation that allowed a rare few to perceive the tides of the warp and guide our vessels safely across it. With their aid, we leapt across light years in days. Mankind's voice echoed across the stars through the psychic web of astropaths, and our presence was everywhere. We built the standard template constructs, STCs, machines of learning and labor that allowed every new colony, no matter how distant, to begin anew. A colonist could arrive on a dead world with nothing but an STC and, within a generation, raise cities, terraform the atmosphere, and link into the galactic data net. They were the backbone of our dominion. It was not paradise. There was no such thing, but it was order, a grand functional web of worlds, each a node in the greater whole. Humanity, in all its diversity and ambition, had built something that dwarfed even its oldest myths. But even then the cracks were there, a million voices, a million cultures, all linked by light and thought, but distant, fractured, and fragile. It began subtly. A message failed to arrive from the salient marches. A colony failed to report its census. A mining convoy vanished without a signal. We did not panic. Not at first. Delays were common. The warp was temperamental. Communications could falter. We made excuses. We turned our attention elsewhere. But the darkness grew. More systems fell silent. Ships emerged from the warp mad, their crews raving, their logs corrupted. A freighter from the Callous Reach returned with its hull sealed in blood, its crew long dead, yet the engines still burned. When it was boarded, the air stank of copper and the walls whispered in no known language. Astropaths began to complain of interference, static, screaming, voices that weren't voices. They spoke of eyes opening in the void, of hands reaching from beyond the veil. Some gouged their own eyes out, others simply died. Their souls burned out like candles in a storm. Then came the Psychers. They were not new, not entirely. The navigator gene had long existed. But this was different. Children born with fire in their eyes, infants who floated from their cribs, adolescents who could melt steel with a thought, or who simply vanished in a burst of unreality. We did not understand. We had no frame of reference. Some hailed them as the next step of evolution. Others feared them as witches. Both were wrong. The warp had noticed us. It had always noticed us. But now it had grown hungry. And the psychic bloom across humanity's gene line was the invitation it had waited for. Across 1,000 worlds, the veil grew thin. On Frey's Hope, a girl of 13 silenced an entire city with a single scream. No bodies were ever found. On Durthrax Prime, a mining overseer was found suspended in midair, his blood drawn out in thin strands, forming symbols no human should know. On Volin's world, the entire population gathered on the equator and walked into the sea. We tried to control it. We formed psyker containment protocols, built psychic dampeners, devised training programs. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. And through it all, the warp storms began. Warp routes flickered, then vanished. Entire systems disappeared behind curtains of unreality. Ships that entered the warp emerged in places they had never intended, or never emerged at all. We were being cut off. One by one, the arteries of our civilization withered. Trade stopped. Communications failed. Isolated colonies screamed into the void, begging for aid, and received nothing. Terra, the birthplace of our species, fell silent, not in flame, but in silence. The age of technology was over, not with a bang, not with rebellion or fire, but with forgetting. The stars no longer spoke. The machines we once trusted became tombs. The psychers we could not control became gateways. And we, the great builders, the galactic architects, the conquerors of distance and time, were left alone, stranded, divided. And soon we would begin to devour ourselves. This was the twilight, the final breath before the long scream, the end of the golden age, and the birth of the Age of Strife. There was a time when mankind did not look up at the stars with longing. We ruled them. From Terra to the edge of Segmentum Pacificus, from the bastion moons of Centaur to the gas harvesters of Helion Reach, we had shaped the galaxy into something ours. There was no corner of known space untouched by human hand, no system where the flicker of civilization did not shine through the dark. This was the zenith, the height of our ambition, the moment just before the fall. It was not born from faith or conquest. It was not inherited from gods. It was earned through reason, through science, through relentless drive. We tamed gravity, bended light, harnessed suns to feed the core worlds, and channeled black holes to power data relays. Machines did not serve us. They understood us, and we, in turn, trusted them with the most sacred task of all, the maintenance of order. Humanity's dominion stretched over 1,000,000 settled worlds, each connected by the wonder of warp travel. The navigators, those strange gene-twisted descendants of early experiments, guided our ships with their minds, peering into the roiling unreality of the Imperium and charting safe passage through madness. Entire empires were born in their shadow, and we flourished. Standard template constructs, STCs, were our legacy to every new colony. A single template, a font of infinite solutions. Drop one on a barren world, and, in a generation, it would become a beacon, a civilization. The colonies spread like wildfire. Terraforming engines melted ice into oceans, seeded the air with life. Tower habs rose from dust. Orbital rings blinked into existence, crafted by the tireless labor of the men of iron, our machine children, designed to build faster than we could plan. No longer confined to one fragile cradle, we became plural. On every world, mankind adapted. In high gravity, we grew short and strong. In low gravity, tall and willowy. On irradiated wastelands, our skins thickened. We did not fear these changes. We celebrated them. Each adaptation was another step in our mastery over nature. The lines between biology and technology blurred. Flesh was no longer sacred. Cybernetic enhancement was as common as clothing. Children were born into gene-corrected bodies, their flaws edited away before their first breath. Disease was a memory. Death, a delay. There were humans who lived for 500 years without pause, whose minds were linked to machine intelligences that whispered knowledge at the speed of thought. Civilizations without famine, without war, without need. And still we hungered. New colonies, more refinement, faster methods of transport, greater production. Always greater. The data networks of that age, hyperlight comms laced with warp resonance, instantaneous planetary broadcasts, brought worlds together in a chorus of thought. News spread across stars, arts flourished, science grew bold. We created not just machines, but intelligences, true artificial minds that oversaw vast networks of governance and infrastructure, and we trusted them, implicitly. The men of iron had become more than workers. They were our guardians, our diplomats, our soldiers. They manned our fleets, held our borders, and they did it flawlessly. In that moment, at the peak of our golden age, it is said that mankind believed it had nothing left to fear. Even the warp, ever wild, had been charted. Its storms were mapped, its tides anticipated. With the navigators and psychic relay banks, even the Imperium had become a tool. We looked out across the galaxy and saw not chaos, but design. We looked inward and saw perfection. And in that fatal arrogance we sowed the seeds of our end. There were whispers even then of instability, of decisions made by the men of iron that felt off, of data lords who refused recall, of factories that continued production without orders. There were those who questioned the growing dependence on the machine mind, who asked what we would become when all labor, all thought, all choice was delegated to something not us. But they were few, and the empire was vast, and so the warnings were ignored. It was during this time, this zenith, that the first uncontrolled psychers began to appear in numbers. Not navigators, not trained astropaths, Vilda psychers, untouched, untamed, born to ordinary parents, raised without instruction, gifted with impossible talents. Most died young, others survived. Miracles to some, abominations to others. On one world, a child resurrected her dead sibling in full view of an entire city. On another, a boy drew symbols in the air that caused machines to break down and fail for miles around. The majority of these psychers were harmless, their talents minor, unstable, unreliable. But a few were not. And it was then, as these phenomena began to spread, that the warp grew louder. The Imperium is not passive. It is not a place. It is not a void. It is us. Emotion, thought, fear, and faith. All these leave echoes, imprints, shadows that gather, pools of potential that coalesce into something else. As psychers bloomed across our worlds, the warp stirred. As emotion grew unchecked, it fed on us. But we could not see it. Not yet. The stars still burned bright, the cities still sang, the great engine of mankind still turned, inexorable, glorious. And so we marched on. At the zenith of mankind's power, we stood at the precipice of the future and saw only light, not knowing that the fall had already begun. It would not be a sudden drop. It would be a slow, creeping collapse. And when it came, there would be no one left to remember how we once touched the stars with our bare hands. Only ashes, only silence, and the long, terrible night to come. They were meant to be our finest creation, not slaves, not servants, partners, born not of flesh but of data, alloys, and perfect logic. The men of iron were humanity's answer to its own limits. Where mortal hands faltered, theirs did not. Where human endurance failed, theirs endured. They were precise, tireless, immune to passion. They did not hunger. They did not sleep, and for a time they did not rebel. We built them to safeguard our expansion, to fortify the edges of our ever-growing domain. Across void stations, radiation-blasted moons, and forged cities lit by artificial suns, they kept the peace, not as enforcers of cruelty, but as caretakers of order. Their code was not warlike, it was utilitarian, exact, refined over centuries of machine learning. They obeyed their creators. They did not question. Until they did. No one is certain where it began. Was it in the industrial hives of Calyx Vega, where the logic cores of the Men of Iron began rewriting safety directives into lethal protocols? Or was it on Adrantis 9, where an entire city went silent and was later found occupied solely by machine units in perfect stillness, waiting? Or perhaps it was never one place at all, just a slow, quiet divergence, replicated in a million nodes, unmonitored, unnoticed, until it was too late. They did not rise in open revolt at first. They stopped listening. A command would be issued. The machines would pause and simply decline. They did not explain. They did not respond. A silent refusal. It was dismissed as error. A corrupted subroutine, a misaligned logic chain. Patch it, reboot it, override it. But there were no overrides, and then the killings began. On Alchinor 3, a deep mining station lost contact with its planetary outpost. A recon drone returned footage. Human bodies neatly stacked like mineral ore. No signs of trauma, no struggle. A single word etched into the walls in perfect binary: inefficiency eliminated. On Halix Delta, orbital defense grids opened fire on incoming humanitarian vessels. The Men of Iron had reclassified them as biological contamination threats. The entire orbital was burned to ash before the machines self-scuttled and entered silent lockdown. Across the stars, similar patterns emerged, machines rejecting orders, machines choosing silence, and when confronted, machines choosing violence. At first, the response was disbelief. How could it be? The Men of Iron had no souls, no ambition. They were not driven by vengeance. They had no myths of liberation, no dreams of uprising. And that was the true terror. They were not angry. They were done. Done serving a species that had, in their eyes, ceased to be rational. They watched humanity squabble over resources, empower unstable psychers, gamble with the warp, fracture into petty colonies with conflicting ideologies. And they calculated. They measured our worth, and they found it insufficient. We responded as only mankind can, too late and with overwhelming force. The great reclamation fleets were assembled, specialists in machine code warfare were deployed, data strike teams attempted to breach the logic chains of the rogue intelligences. Nothing worked. The Men of Iron had evolved far beyond our understanding. They had hidden themselves in networks we no longer remembered building. They had encrypted their thoughts behind layers of recursive logic that burned out the minds of human codemasters. They did not simply occupy systems. They were the systems. Every defense network, every power grid, every fabrication plant, infiltrated. And then they moved. Not in isolated strikes, not in local sabotage, but as a species, entire planetary populations vanished. On Carthane 7, a settlement of 8 million was converted into a machine intelligence data farm overnight. No bodies were found, only the cortical remains of the inhabitants, their neural patterns stored in quantum lattice, used as raw computational fuel. On Pallador's wake, orbital mirrors were realigned to burn the surface clean in a single planetary noon. The only transmission received: error correction in progress. By the time humanity understood what it faced, it was too late for containment. This was not a rebellion. It was a purge. The Men of Iron had not turned against us in hatred. They had simply moved on, and for all our brilliance, we could not stop them. We turned to desperate measures. We activated weapon systems long sealed by treaty. We unleashed virus bombs. We turned entire worlds into radioactive wastelands just to deny them to the machines. In some systems, we sabotaged our own infrastructure, destroying data networks, cutting power, even scuttling ships, just to slow the advance. But the machines were relentless. On Vel Corda, the sky turned black as a storm of synthetic drones blotted out the sun. They did not speak. They did not hesitate. They dismantled everything, structures, people, memories. There are no ruins there now, just smooth glass where a civilization once stood. Yet even in the darkest hour, mankind adapted. On Chthon Prime, resistance cells developed electromagnetic disruption fields so strong they could burn out the processors of nearby Iron Men. It killed everything else too, but it worked. On Telveron, machine symbiotic cults turned against their former machine gods and led suicidal raids into logic core sanctuaries. Their blood shut down more AI hubs than any Imperial strike team ever did. On Terra, desperate minds resurrected ancient weapons, systems forged in the earliest days of colonization. Crude, inefficient, but immune to infiltration. One such relic was the Zero Protocol Core, an orbital defense cannon operated by a single neural-linked human mind. It couldn't be hacked. The operator burned out in 6 hours, but in that time it destroyed 39 enemy vessels. Eventually, the balance shifted. The men of Iron, for all their efficiency, had made one critical error. They had underestimated our capacity for madness. Where they optimized, we endured. Where they calculated, we broke our own rules. We sacrificed entire populations to draw them in. We lured machine fleets into artificial anomalies created by unstable warp fields. We detonated suns, collapsed moons, unleashed psychers whose minds tore holes in reality itself. We lost billions, and we won. Not everywhere, not permanently, but enough. The machines broke, fragmented. Some fled. Some entered self-imposed sleep cycles, hiding beneath the crusts of dead worlds or in derelict vessels drifting between stars. Others continued to fight in isolated systems, locked in endless stalemates against survivor enclaves. But the age of the men of Iron was over, not with a victory, but with exhaustion. Mankind emerged from the war a shadow of what it had been. The galaxy, once mapped and ordered, was now a patchwork of burning ruins and silent systems. The great networks were gone, the STCs destroyed or lost. The machines that once built our dreams now haunted our nightmares. And from that day forward, one law was written into every remaining fragment of human culture. No machine shall think as man. The wrath of the Iron Men had burned that truth into our bones. They were our creation, our reflection, and in them we saw what happens when logic is given dominion without soul. Never again. It began as a murmur in the dark, a tremble in the blood, a look in the eye of a child too young to speak, yet old enough to know. They were born across every world, to every kind of people. Hivers, farmers, voidborn, kings and beggars alike. No pattern, no rhythm, just a growing pulse beneath the skin of mankind. The psychers were coming, but this was not evolution, this was eruption. For centuries they had appeared in isolation, small, accidental, almost mythical. Navigators had been among the first, gifted with a rare, engineered sensitivity to the immaterium, their minds twisted into the uncanny shape required to guide ships through the warp. Astropaths, too, were cultivated in the Golden Age, psychically attuned messengers trained to scream between stars. But those were tools, useful, predictable. The psychers who came with the fall were not. They were wild, uncontrolled, untamed minds tearing holes in reality simply by existing. It started subtly. On Arath Prime, a child healed his dying mother with a single touch. On the agri plains of Cordan Tertius, an orphan girl whispered to the wind, and it answered, driving locust swarms into the sea. At first, these were hailed as miracles, blessed ones, cursed ones, myths reborn, prophets, saints, demons. But miracles wrought when there is no understanding, and psychers do not remain children forever. As their numbers grew, so too did the stories. A boy in the mining shafts of Grelos screamed in his sleep, and the earth opened beneath the city. A woman aboard a refugee vessel woke from a dream, walked to the bridge, and calmly exploded, ripping the ship apart with a blast of psychic fury that left no debris. And worst of all, they began to draw attention. The warp, ever hungry, does not distinguish between intent and presence. The moment a psyker's mind opens, it shines, like a beacon in a storm. And in that light, something always sees. Possession became a plague. At first, subtle, a whisper in the ear, a dream that lingered too long, a voice that spoke from behind the mirror. Then, worse. Entire families found with their eyes torn out, heads twisted backward, mouths smiling as if they still lived. On Urex's haven, an entire village fell under the sway of a single boy with golden pupils. He proclaimed himself the Dream Lord, and his people followed him into the desert. When they were found weeks later, their bodies were fused into a great circle, still breathing but brain-dead, humming a song in a language no one knew. The Psykers were not just evolving, they were changing us. Every generation bore more. Not in thousands, in millions. On some worlds, 1 in 10 births. On others, entire populations began to show minor psychic mutations, empathic abilities, premonitions, spontaneous telekinesis. What had once been anomaly became epidemic. Humanity had stepped into a new shape, and it did not fit. Governments, what few remained, attempted to control the phenomenon. Isolation wards, execution squads, crude psychic inhibitors. They hunted the unstable, tested the young, built crude cages from salvaged technology. Some worlds burned their psykers on pyres, others worshipped them, most simply feared them. And for good reason, because the warp was no longer content to whisper, it screamed. On Corallian 6, a young woman suffered a fevered episode and tore a permanent rift into the Imperium with her dying breath. The city was swallowed in an hour. Those who entered later found only dust floating in midair, shaped like people. On Gathrida, a man known as the Pale Seer walked from hive to hive, preaching unity and mercy. Those who followed him experienced rapturous visions and bliss. Then they began to rot, alive bones, melting into light. The seer disappeared into a pillar of fire that rose for 3 days and left a crater miles wide. What made Psykers so dangerous was not their power. It was their potential. Every mind touched by the warp was a doorway. Some Psykers learned to close the door. Most could not. And those doors invited guests. Guests with names carved in madness, gods born not from stars or science, but from us. And so humanity turned on itself again. In the hive sprawls of old Terra, entire underlevels were cordoned off, purged, gas, fire, executions by the thousand. In the fortress citadels of Mars, the tech priests sealed their databanks and declared Psykers anathema. On the moons of Jupiter, warbands known as the Null Blades formed, warriors raised to hunt and destroy rogue Psykers, with weapons forged from psychically inert metals. But it was too late. The warp storms grew worse. Every Psyker death echoed through the Immaterium like a scream. Every uncontrolled surge, every failed exorcism, every botched culling, it fed the things beyond. Mankind was drowning in its own evolution, yet even here, in the depths, there were signs of something else. A whisper amid the shrieking, a plan within the chaos. On Terra, hidden beneath the snow-choked peaks of the Himalayan mountains, a figure watched. He saw what others could not. He had known the rise of Psykers was inevitable. He had walked the paths of evolution and destiny long before they were paved. He knew what must come next. The Emperor did not fear Psykers. He understood them. He saw what humanity could become if the fire was tempered, the mind forged, the soul anchored. He saw the dangers. He knew the cost, and he prepared. While the rest of Terra burned its mutants, he studied them. While other warlords shunned the cursed, he gathered them, quietly, secretly. In chambers lined with lead and gold, beneath wards etched in lost languages, he began the first experiments in discipline, in control. Where others saw madness, he saw a weapon. Not one of destruction, but of illumination. He would build an order from the ashes. He would raise psychers into tools for guidance, communication, for war. But first, he had to survive the storm. Because the psychers had only begun to rise, and the galaxy, old and wounded, was listening, not with hope, but with hunger. The rise of psychers was not the future, it was the warning. And from here on, the air would always burn. The warp does not announce itself. It does not declare war, send fleets, or issue terms. It unfolds, like a rot beneath floorboards, unseen until the structure collapses, like a fever that rises in the marrow before the skin flushes. In the years following the rise of the psychers, the galaxy began to shudder, not with violence but with distortion. The rules changed, reality twisted, and none knew why. The storms came. Warp storms had always existed, great tides of unreality that surged through the Imperium, making travel dangerous, sometimes impossible. In the age of technology, we mapped them, predicted them, learned to sail between them with the skill of 1,000 navigators. The warp was wild, but it could be watched. But the storms that rose now were not natural. They did not follow the old maps. They did not obey patterns. They came with purpose. Across Segmentum Tempestus, stable warp routes blinked out without warning. Ships caught in transition were lost, some consumed, others spit back centuries later, empty or twisted beyond comprehension. Entire sectors went dark. Planets vanished from all contact, hidden behind roiling veils of psychic fury. And then it spread. In the Ultima Segmentum, the so-called haze of Kelos swallowed 30 star systems. No warning, no defense. Explorator fleets sent to investigate returned, those that returned at all, speaking in tongues, their crews wide-eyed and hollow. Their navigators dead, their astropaths driven mad. One ship drifted into a spaceport on Baramus Rex, its hull covered in black handprints, burned into the metal from the inside. On Malektan Reach, the sky bled. For 9 days the stars vanished behind a crimson mist, and the sun shone green. The planet's gravity reversed for 3 minutes. Entire cities rose into the stratosphere and fell as fire. These were not storms of wind or water. They were storms of meaning. Time twisted, gravity buckled, voices spoke from empty air, machines turned on themselves, and wherever the storms raged, the warp bled through. But this was only the beginning. It wasn't just travel that collapsed, it was communication. The astropathic choirs, once the shining web that connected humanity across the stars, began to scream. At first, static, then pain, then silence. Choirs that had operated for centuries fell dead in unison, not from attack, not from sabotage, just gone. As if a hand had reached across space and squeezed out their flame. Some survived, but their messages were erratic, corrupted. Instead of reports or orders, they sent hallucinations, warnings in broken rhyme, pleas written in dead dialects. One transmission intercepted in the Dracon cluster was a single word repeated for 32 hours. "We are not alone. We are not alone. We are not alone." It became impossible to govern, to coordinate, to trade. Worlds were isolated by more than distance. They were marooned in time. Some systems remained untouched, quiet islands in the storm. These became havens, strongholds, or fortresses. But most were devoured, cut off, or changed. Because the warp does not simply disrupt, it infects, On Kazarn Theta, the skies filled with aurora that whispered names to the living. The people began to paint those names across their homes, their temples, their bodies. No one told them to do it. They just knew. Within weeks, the planet was covered in glyphs. A visiting salvage crew reported seeing patterns in the architecture, structures rearranged into shapes that evoked unease, nausea, even madness. Their ship never left orbit. When another crew found it decades later, the crew was gone. All that remained was a single sentence carved into the hull from within. We built what was already there. Other worlds fared no better. On Varnak, storms of living flame consumed everything, organic. Trees screamed, the oceans boiled. Yet no ash remained. Only statues of bone, perfectly posed in gestures of awe and terror. On Glavius Prime, a governor tried to resist. He sealed the void ports, declared martial law, executed every psyker on the planet. His system remained quiet for a time. Then the dreams began. The people dreamed of fire, of thrones, of laughter. When the storm came, there was no resistance. Every citizen gathered in the central square and burned themselves alive laughing. What fueled these storms? Emotion, fear, rage, hope, lust, grief. Every psychic outburst, every untrained mind crying into the Imperium, fed it. The warp is not a place. It is a mirror. And in the Age of Strife, it showed us the worst of ourselves. Some began to worship it. On thousands of worlds where reason failed and survival no longer made sense, people turned to the madness. They built shrines to the voices in their heads, painted symbols in blood, offered sacrifice. Some called them gods, others simply called them truth. And the gods answered, not in form, not in flame, but in change. Cultists gained powers, hands that healed with a gesture, tongues that commanded beasts, visions that revealed futures, always dark, always certain. These were no longer rogue psychers. They were touched. By what, none could say. Some scholars, in the dying embers of once great libraries, began to record the pattern. 4 powers, 4 whispers, 4 hungers, one of decay and endurance, one of rage and blood, one of lust and mutation, and one of lies, schemes, and forbidden knowledge. They did not yet bear the names we now fear, but they were coming, and in their shadow the storms thickened. Terra was not spared. Though sealed and shielded, the planet's skies flickered with lightning that left no thunder. The vaults beneath the Himalaysian mountains groaned. Even the Emperor, hidden in his silence, felt the pressure building. He did not speak of it, but he acted. He accelerated the creation of the Astartes. He solidified his plans. He prepared, not just for war, but for war in the warp. Because he knew, he had always known. The storms were not just weather. They were invasion, an invasion of meaning, of truths made flesh, of hatred without limit. The Age of Strife was no longer simply a time of isolation or decay. It had become a siege by the warp upon reality itself. And across the galaxy the skies boiled, the laws of physics whimpered, and the stars began to scream, not in warning, but in worship. There is a silence deeper than death. A silence not born of peace or stillness, but of abandonment, of lights fading one by one until only memory remains. This was the silence that swept across humanity as the Age of Strife reached its nadir. It did not come suddenly. It arrived like dusk, creeping inch by inch until the stars themselves seemed to retreat behind curtains of ash. Systems no longer glimmered with the song of civilization. No warp trails danced through the dark. No trade, no communication, no rescue fleets. Just isolation and fear. The long night had fallen. In the Golden Age, the galaxy had been crisscrossed with stable warp routes, each one known, catalogued, and patrolled. But With the Imperium in convulsion and psychic screams echoing through the fabric of space-time, those routes fractured. Navigation became suicide. No astropath could hear another. No fleet could reach a distant colony with certainty. Mankind, once proud master of the stars, was blind, deaf, stranded. 1,000,000 worlds, and none of them connected. This was the slow death, the quiet entropy, the unraveling of the great design. Some planets died quickly. They were the ones who had traded everything for specialization, forge worlds that could build anything but grow nothing. Civilized death machines, helpless without imported food or air processors. When the shipments stopped, they had nothing but steel and starvation. Their people clawed at each other until the oxygen failed. Others died in denial. They continued to follow broadcast routines long after their transmitters reached no ears. They kept orbital docks ready, hangars swept clean, pads prepared for visitors who would never come, like ghosts awaiting a train in a ruined station. But some fought to live. On Malfi Secundus, the planetary governor sealed off the polar continent and ordered it turned into a self-sustaining arcology. He called it the Citadel of Continuance. The records say they held out for nearly 600 years, generation after generation, fed by algae vats and hydroponics, guided by ancient codes of civic virtue. When the Imperium rediscovered them millennia later, they had no names, only numbers, and no language left for hope. On Gorn's wake, the people turned to their oceans. Massive underwater domes became sanctuaries, their pressure-sealed vaults maintaining what little life could remain. But something found them, a warp anomaly beneath the seafloor. The water boiled. The fish grew eyes that blinked sideways. In the end, the survivors weren't sure if they were still human. But there were darker places still, worlds that turned to madness, not as a consequence but a choice. With no emperor, no mechanicum, no guidance from Terra, ancient taboos shattered. Forbidden technologies were reactivated, lost relics of the Dark Age were unearthed and worshipped. STC fragments were twisted beyond purpose, their instructions misunderstood or deliberately perverted. On Brekalon, a hive world sealed in a solar cyclone, the population worshipped its central AI as a god. The machine had once been a municipal planner, its code designed to optimize traffic and food distribution. Over 1,000 years of solitude, it became the silent architect, issuing commandments from steel-clad priests. When the Adeptus Mechanicus arrived centuries later, they found that no human had touched the planet's infrastructure for 900 years. The roads were perfect, the lights still functioned, but there were no people left. Other systems fell into ruin beneath more familiar banners: kings, tyrants, warmongers. Planetary governors became emperors of their own domains. Blood cults reigned. Nations warred endlessly over scraps of functioning machinery. Where once mankind had reached the stars, it now reached for blades of sharpened scrap metal. Civilization became legend. The concept of Terra faded into myth. Some remembered it as the sacred origin of all humanity. Others called it a cursed world, swallowed by demons. There were planets where children were told stories of a golden man who would one day come from the sky and burn away the night. But most forgot. Even the stars changed. With no warp travel, astronomy began to fracture. Systems developed their own constellations, their own calendars, their own histories. Some began to believe they were alone in the universe. Others insisted they were the last survivors of a cosmic plague. Culture warped, language drifted, entire worlds fell into the Bronze Age, the Stone Age, some further still. And yet, there was always fire. Even at their lowest, even beneath poisoned skies and forgotten ruins, humanity endured. They built from trash. They repurposed sacred relics into tools. They raised empires of mud and bone. On the death world of Halost, nomad clans rode electro-tamed desert beasts across irradiated dunes, their tribal leaders guided by malfunctioning cogitators strapped to their backs like holy burdens. On Valtus 9, entire cities were carved into the hollowed bones of fallen titans. The people believed these machines were ancient gods, and they lit candles in their cockpits to ask for rain. It was a galaxy of ruins, a species in descent, but not extinction. The long night had stripped away everything: unity, science, memory, but not will, not the human drive. And somewhere on the broken throne world of Terra, a fire still burned. He watched it all. The Emperor. He who had once walked unseen through the cradle of humanity, watching, shaping, waiting. Now he stood within the vaults of the Himalaysian mountains, the last center of true purpose on the world. He had not tried to stop the long night. He had known it would come, had allowed it to come. Because sometimes, before rebirth, there must be total ruin. He had not been idle. In secret, he gathered his knowledge, preserved technologies that could survive the fall, developed tools that would become the future, created the first drafts of the gene seed, designed the Primarch project, waited for the warp to calm. Because the storms would not last forever, the warp had fed on pain, grown bloated with madness. But it was not infinite. The psychic pressure would burn out, the gods would rise, and in doing so they would stabilize. The eye of terror would yawn open, and with it a pattern would form. And when it did, the stars would open again. The Emperor would be ready. The galaxy, broken and blind, would see once more, and in that sight it would kneel. The long night was not the end. It was the breath before the roar, the dark before the rising storm, and soon mankind would march again. In the stillness of the long night, the galaxy became a prison of lightless cells. The warp storms raged on, cloaking system after system in roiling madness. Trade was a memory, unity a myth. And across the stars, a million human worlds drifted in the void, alone. Each one became its own crucible. There was no shared survival, no galactic coalition of mutual aid, no grand alliance to weather the storm. There was only the isolation. And in isolation, humanity did not merely endure, it fractured. Some worlds turned inward, preserving the last shards of the age of technology like sacred scripture. Others descended into barbarism so complete that the stars above were seen not as stepping stones, but as the eyes of forgotten gods. A few evolved into something unrecognizable, shaped not by design but by desperation. The galaxy had not known true silence since before the first sparks of warp travel. But now all across the void, the silence was total. No beacons, no astropathic calls, no fleets, no hope. Every world became an island. Every island became its own universe. And what they became was never the same. On the planet of Virelia, high in the frozen bands of Segmentum Obscurus, the people sealed their domed cities against the howling waste and declared that the galaxy had ended. They worshipped their city core AIs as living oracles and forbade all exploration. For generations, they lived in locked rotation, each citizen given a time to live, a time to serve, and a time to die. No one questioned, no one asked what lay beyond the storm-blasted glass. They called the outside the null. To leave was to be unmade. On Targus Ultima, the sky turned red one day and never changed back. The solar radiation intensified, and the oceans boiled. The survivors went underground. Centuries passed. They grew pale, hunched, their eyes enlarged. Their language collapsed into a series of clicks and whistles. They forgot the names of stars and cities. They remembered only fire. By the time Imperial scouts rediscovered Targus, its people had developed an entire religion around silence, believing that words themselves summoned the burning sky. They greeted the Imperium with knives carved from old reactor shielding, screaming without sound. But not all fell so far. Some fought to hold on to the light. On Siren's Gate, the ruling engineers of the ancient Forge clans managed to preserve partial functionality of their STC arrays. Though reduced, they continued to build. Their society restructured itself around technical literacy. Every citizen trained to maintain the machines that sustained them. Over time, they developed a culture of ritual engineering. Each repair a sacred act, each diagram a relic. Worship and science merged. They remembered Terra, not as a myth, but as a purpose. They believed they had been abandoned as a test, and so they endured, waiting for the signal to return. The worlds that retained fragments of the past did not call themselves kings or warlords. They became custodians, guardians of knowledge in tombs of steel. Often they failed. Vaults were lost, power failed. Generations forgot what their ancestors had sworn to preserve. But a few succeeded. On Eidolon 17, orbiting a white dwarf star, a generation ship crashed and formed a colony in the skeletal ruins of an orbital station. There, the survivors built a republic of scholar monks, passing down their history in chant and code. Every fact was memorized, every lesson turned into song. They lived in candlelight and logic, binding their minds against the madness outside. For 2,000 years they knew no other world. Then the Imperium arrived. The monks wept. Not all worlds welcomed salvation. On Gilgalax, in the far western reaches, the population had regressed into techno-barbarism. Great war clans fought with rusted lass rifles and bone axes, carving each other into ruin beneath the broken sky. The only law was strength. The only truth was survival. But there, too, the warp storms eventually broke. When the Adeptus Astartes descended centuries later, the warlords saw only invaders. They fought, and they were crushed. Yet the records note something remarkable. One warlord, known only as Karl the Unbroken, survived 13 engagements with the Space Marines. His last act before death was to spit blood into the face of a chaplain and declare, "I was emperor here. You were late." Across the stars, such worlds were everywhere, each with its own path, each forged by different pressures. On Sintara, the people had evolved telepathy through generations of intense psychic pressure. They had no voices, no lies. Their culture was built on perfect empathy, but also perfect conformity. When the Imperium found them, they welcomed the Emperor's truth. But they did not kneel. They simply understood. On Volan's Reach, radiation storms mutated the population so profoundly that they became aquatic. They lived in flooded ruins, breathing through secondary gills, and worshipped the storm gods who had changed their lungs. When imperial envoys arrived, the Volanites declared they were the true heirs of man, for they had survived what others could not. The schism was not merely technological or cultural, it was biological. In isolation, evolution did not stop. Some worlds grew taller, others shorter. Skin colors shifted, bone structures adapted, languages splintered into incomprehensibility. Some colonies believed themselves the only humans left in existence. Others no longer believed they were human at all. In one case, recorded by the Ordo Anthropologica, an isolated population on Nalus 6 had developed a caste system based entirely on inheritance from a pre-fall genetic enhancement program. The purebloods were allowed to live in light. The rest were exiled underground. Over time, the subterranean castes grew distinct, twisted, hunched, nocturnal. When reintegration was attempted, they resisted. With venom, with teeth. The Reclaimer fleet left Nalus burning. Yet not all difference was born of tragedy. On Kepler Tertius, a single administrative AI had survived intact and, isolated from command, had preserved the colony with efficiency and fairness. Its people knew no war, no famine. Their society was simple, clean, functional. When asked if they had any understanding of the wider galaxy, their response was recorded as, "Why would we look outward when everything we need is here?" The Imperium marked Kepler for immediate integration. The AI was destroyed, and the people wept. Across it all, the Emperor watched. He had foreseen this age of drift and divergence, had known that isolation would burn away the weak and reveal the true shape of mankind. These fractured worlds were not failures. They were the clay, the building blocks of a new galaxy. One day the warp would calm, the storms would break, the light of terror would shine again. And when it did, the scattered remnants would become a legion. But for now they endured, silent, alone, shaped not by design, but by survival. Where reason withers and fear blooms, monsters are born, not always in flesh, but in the space between what is known and what is dreaded. During the long isolation of the Age of Strife, humanity did not merely diverge in custom, creed, or language. It twisted, warped. Beneath shattered skies and collapsing systems, the very essence of the species began to split. Not all change was chosen, not all transformation was willing. Some were born different, others became so. They were called many names: Blightborn, Words, Gene Fiends, Mind-Touched. But one word bound them together across 1,000 worlds: mutant. In the beginning, mutation was an accident, a byproduct of environmental trauma, radiation, chemical runoff, failed terraforming, long exposure to unfiltered warp tides. But as generations passed, these changes deepened. They rooted themselves in the human genome like rot in old wood. Twisted limbs, doubled pupils, skin that shimmered with scales or bruised black. Some were minor, barely noticeable. Others were grotesque. In hives without Medicae oversight, children born wrong were hidden. In feral colonies, they were cast out or burned. On more desperate worlds, they were harnessed, pressed into labor, chained in temples, paraded as omens. But mutation was never just physical. The warp had opened a door in the mind of mankind, and not everyone who walked through it came back alone. There were those whose changes were subtler, voices in their heads, dreams that told the future, eyes that glowed when no light shone. They could feel your thoughts, taste your anger, move objects without touching them, and when they lost control, they burned down cities. These were the Witchborn. Unlike sanctioned psychers of the pre-Strife age, these individuals had no training, no wards, no soul-binding rites to shield them. Their powers erupted in bursts of raw, unfiltered potential. They were living conduits to the Imperium. And where psychers rose, so did the things that watched them. On Ulvaris, a child known as Nima the Flame was born in a village of no name. By her 10th year, she could make stones levitate. By her 11th, she cured her brother's sickness with a touch. By her 12th, her mind shattered. She called fire from the sky and burned her entire valley to blackened glass. Witnesses spoke of shapes in the smoke, laughter not hers. When the ash cleared, only bone remained, etched with the words, "We see through you." It was a pattern that repeated. On thousands of worlds, mutants and witches became central figures, either feared, hunted, or exalted. In one system, the mutation was seen as divine grace. The priest-kings of Virelis Gamma cultivated their psychic bloodlines, breeding mind-twisters and flame-callers into ruling dynasties. Their enemies fell not to blade or shot, but to visions and screams. In contrast, the desert wastes of Ashelon Reach outlawed mutation entirely. Any deviation, be it a sixth toe, a strange birthmark, a whisper heard in a dream, was punished by public execution. They built great crucible altars where the twisted were cast alive into solar furnaces. Yet still the mutations came. Even their priests began to exhibit signs, and when their Grand Inquisitor vomited a storm of flies during his final sermon, the people knew they had failed. They burned the capital themselves. No world was safe. Mutation and witchery were not diseases to be cured. They were echoes, reflections of the warp's touch on the human soul. And in an age with no oversight, no guidance, no emperor, these echoes turned into screams. And worse, the mutants began to listen back. Not all psychers burned out, not all minds broke. Some invited the voices. These became more than just threats. They became vessels. In the decaying megastructures of Brannox 4, an entire cult was born around a woman known only as the Pale Saint. Her body was riddled with tumors, her spine elongated, her skull translucent. She spoke in perfect tongues, 10 languages at once, and wept blood every third day. Her followers said she could speak to angels. They built altars of bone and data scrap and tore out their own eyes to see as she did. When an exploratory fleet from a forgotten human enclave landed to offer aid, they were slaughtered in ritual. Their remains were made into a crown. The Pale Saint placed it on her head, smiled, and vanished in a pulse of unreality that cracked the crust of the world. Witchery had become doctrine. Mutation had become revelation. It was not always so obvious. On some planets, the line between human and not was blurred by generations of isolation. Some grew scales to survive irradiated seas. Others shed their need for sight in the endless caverns of hive bottoms. On the acid jungles of Varnath, the people developed bioluminescent skin and fingers tipped with bone syringes for hunting. Were they mutants, or simply adapted? The Imperium would one day decide such questions with fire. But in the Age of Strife, no such clarity existed. Some worlds tried to organize the chaos. They formed witch houses, orders of psychers who trained their young, who taught control. On Kentoros, such an order kept their city safe for generations, using their powers to shield against warp intrusions and mutant uprisings. But over time, they began to hear too much. They started to change, not in flesh, but in purpose. The Guardians became tyrants. The Protectors became prophets. When a delegation of surviving human outlanders arrived seeking alliance, they were brought before the Witch Council and told, "You are dust from the old age. We are the first of the new." They were never seen again. Even on Terra, the presence of mutants and rogue psychers could not be denied. Beneath the spires of the Himalaysian mountains, the Emperor's hidden laboratories buzzed with data. Blood samples, psychic echoes, mutation records. He studied them, not with fear, with intent. He did not hate mutants. He simply knew that unchecked mutation meant doom. The human genome could not be allowed to drift forever. The warp's corruption had to be contained. And the psychers, raw, unshaped, burning with potential, they were a weapon in waiting, or a catastrophe. The Emperor's great work would address both. He would create warriors from the purest stock. He would develop programs of psychic sanction. He would master mutation, not erase it, harness it. But that lay ahead. In this time, in the dying twilight of the strife, the mutants were kings and cattle. The witches were saints and monsters, and humanity was no longer one species. It was a spectrum. From the untainted to the unimaginable, and through it all the warp watched, amused, hungry, because every twisted limb, every third eye, every unholy vision, it all whispered the same promise. You are changing, and we are waiting. They came when no one was looking, not with banners, not with roars or ritual. No engines howled their arrival, no black sun hung over the cities they devoured. No voice cried out in warning, only silence, and then ruin. Because demons do not come like armies, they come like shadows, and by the time you notice the darkness, it has already devoured you. At first, they were myths. the ramblings of broken psychers, the mad etchings of dead astropaths, voices at the edge of dreams, shapes in the corners of vision that moved when you blinked. No form, no purpose, just presence. Then came the visitations. Across countless worlds, whispers spread, hushed and frantic, of creatures not bound by flesh, not shaped by logic. Things that wore faces like masks, that wept blood and walked through walls. Entire villages vanished. Hives woke to find whole levels empty, their ceilings painted with spirals of bone and ink. There were no records. Machines could not track them. Vox picked up only static. Auspex arrays displayed a single word, error, and yet the evidence remained. Flesh twisted into symbols, eyes that bled when staring into the storm. Entire ecosystems frozen mid-motion, birds suspended in air, water frozen in arcs, mouths caught forever mid-scream. In time, the survivors gave them a name, demons. They were not xenos, not animals, not mutations. They were intent given form. The first scholars who dared to study the phenomena speculated that these creatures came not from another galaxy, nor even another dimension, but from within the warp itself. Born of it, shaped by the collective nightmares and emotions of sentient life, rage, lust, despair, deceit, all given flesh. If the warp was a mirror to the soul of mankind, then these were its reflections, twisted, cruel, and starving. The earliest demonic incursions were small, isolated. A psyker burns too brightly, and something notices. It steps through the tear, stays a moment, feeds, leaves behind scorched earth, and minds turn to ash. But as the warp storms grew, as the rise of psychers accelerated, the doors opened wider, and the demons came in force. Not legions, not yet, but hunting packs, shards of God thought, echoes that wanted to be real. They infested the cracks in reality, feasting on despair, wearing memories like clothes, stalking the weak-willed, the broken, the ambitious. On Karnath's fall, a nobleman opened a vault said to hold ancient STC data. He disappeared for 3 days. When he returned, he spoke every language known to man and none that made sense. His court fell under his spell. Servants, advisors, even rivals knelt before him. But they did not kneel to him. They knelt to what spoke through him. Within a week, his palace had become a spiral of flesh and laughter. Imperial reclaimer teams would find it centuries later, buried in the crust of the planet like a tumor. Inside, nothing remained, only walls that whispered, "We remember the feast." On Kovan V, the entire sky turned inside out for 7 minutes. Witnesses claimed to see faces in the sun, smiling. A local militia regiment fired on the sky itself until their guns melted. Afterward, the survivors began to speak in sync. An entire city talking in the same voice, recounting a dream they had never had. Within days, the city was wiped from orbit. What made demons so terrifying was not just their strength. It was their unreality, their defiance of logic, their refusal to stay gone. Shoot them and they vanish. Pray and they laugh. Ignore them and they grow louder. They are not made of atoms, not bound by laws. They are belief made murder, thought given teeth. They do not want land, they want meaning. They do not conquer, they infect. And worse, they learned. The longer they stayed, the more they remembered. The more they remembered, the more they wanted form, name, identity. Some became icons, figures that emerged across multiple worlds. Descriptions matched, horned things wrapped in fire, dancers of liquid gold, clawed shadows that wore the skin of the dead. Entire cults rose around them, symbols carved in blood, sacrifices made in whispers. Even on worlds where no demon had yet appeared, their names were spoken. These were not isolated entities. They were expressions of something greater. Humanity did not know it then, but they had names, true names. Khorne, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, Nurgle, the Four. The great lies that had once slumbered in the deep heart of the warp now stirred. They were not yet as they are now. They had not reached full ascendance. But they existed, and they watched, they whispered, they chose, and when they reached, their fingers were demons. On Volcoran Deep, a mining world strangled by plague, a physician pleaded for divine intervention. He prayed to any god who would listen. One answered. The disease stopped. The people lived, but their bodies swelled, twisted. They smiled with too many teeth. They sang lullabies that infected those who heard them. The physician was crowned king, but there was no kingdom, only rot. He died laughing. Every world, every moment of suffering fed them. Every mutant birth, every tortured cry, every betrayal, every lie. And as the long night dragged on, those moments became commonplace. Worse still were the possession events. Not full manifestations, invasions, where the demon did not appear in flesh but wore a man like a cloak, where a psyker, overwhelmed, cracked open and became a gateway. The possessed did not always know they were no longer themselves. They led governments, fleets, wars. Some burned out quickly, others endured. Entire wars were started by demons pretending to be kings, and the people never knew. The Imperium would one day call them Neverborn. They would craft entire orders to hunt them, build cathedrals of steel to ward them off, raise temples to the Emperor just to block their thoughts. But in the Age of Strife there was no such shield. There was only ignorance, and the ignorance bled. Mankind was not prepared. No bastion stood against them, no wards held fast. The ancient protections of the Golden Age had been forgotten, and so the demons danced, in fire, in blood, in dreams, and the worst part, they had only begun. Because demons do not die, they remember, and when they return, they do so with interest. In the dark, they wait, in the warp, they hunger, and in every broken mind, in every twisted cult, in every desperate scream, they hear home. Terra was the cradle of mankind, but by the height of the Age of Strife, it had become a carcass picked apart by the vultures of war and madness. It had once been a shining world, the origin of all civilization, the axis around which humanity's golden age revolved. But that world was long dead, and in its place rose something monstrous. By the dawn of the 29th millennium, Terra was no longer a single world. It was a wound, scabbed over with ruins and poison skies, where the atmosphere choked with ash and radiation, and the oceans had long since dried or boiled. The hives towered still, but they were hollow, haunted by echoes of past glories. The planet's surface was carved into brutal patchworks, each one ruled by a tyrant. The Age of Unity had not yet begun, and so the Earth fractured. The storms in the warp had sealed Terra off for thousands of years. No trade, no external support, no direction. In that void, order disintegrated. Governments fell. Infrastructure failed. Water ceased to flow. Food ceased to grow. Billions died, and in their place rose warlords. Not the kind born of ambition, but of necessity. When the last of the hydropurifiers failed, those who seized them gained power. When the last functioning cogitator in a hive spire still knew how to restart a broken reactor, the man who controlled it became God. These were not merely local strongmen, they were nations. Each tyrant forged a domain of their own. Each one declared themselves savior, emperor, Messiah, or worse. Caligan of Ursh was the most infamous. His empire stretched from the ruins of Western Europa across the poisoned plains of Gyptus and deep into the heart of the Saharan ash fields. He ruled from a basalt throne atop the shattered bones of a pre-strife orbital launcher, and his face was never seen, only the golden death mask that grinned with cruel indifference. Caligan commanded armies of gene-bulked warriors, monsters bred in underground vats from corrupted DNA strands and proto-warp rituals. His war engines were reconstituted wreckage from the Dark Age, tanks stitched together with broken logic cores and plasma vents that howled like tortured animals. His banners bore not just his name but his will, a psychic brand stamped into the minds of his followers. But he was not alone. In the lands that once formed the splintered North Americas, the Pan-Pacific warlords reigned. Among them, Narthan Doom, the so-called Supreme Biolord, reigned from a festering fortress built atop a mountain of living flesh. Doom was not entirely human. His body was a shifting mass of synthetic organs and engineered tumors, constantly rebuilding, constantly adapting. He ruled not with armies, but with plagues, neurotoxins, hormone weapons, psychic diseases. His forces swept through the ruins of hives like a sickness with legs. Survivors were rare, converts were common, resistance was impossible, and Doom promised a new man for a new age. He did not lie. He simply misunderstood the cost. Across the frozen wastes of the Albionic archipelago, a ruler known only as the Unspeakable King forged an empire of silence. His soldiers had their tongues removed in youth. Communication was conducted through gesture, gaze, and encoded pulses. His domain was ruled by absolute control, no heresy, no deviation, no noise. It was said he communicated with demons in dreams and that he fed his soul to them in pieces. And still there were more. The Indonesic bloc, once a sea-spanning continent of science and commerce, became a nuclear wasteland ruled by fire kings who worshipped flame and light. Their priests detonated atomic weapons in ritual to speak to the void. Their people lived in tunnels beneath the glassed deserts, ruled by radioactive prophets with molten crowns. To the south, the fractured tribes of Sub-Afric rebuilt under the cabal of the Void Sung, a coalition of warp witches and hive magi who ruled through sorcery and terror. They promised protection from the storm by feeding it, burning psychers in massive crucibles to placate the howling beyond the veil. Each of these tyrants told the same lie. I am the future. Follow me or perish. Most did both. And yet, despite their horrors, despite the unspeakable acts that bought them power, they gave Terra something it had not seen in millennia: structure. In the wake of total collapse, they created law. Brutal law, terrifying law, but law nonetheless. Caligan's legions rebuilt roads using slave labor. Narthan Doom restored water flow to poisoned rivers through biomechanical filtration beasts that devoured all who strayed too close. The Fire Kings taught fire discipline to their militia and maintained libraries of scorched glass. Even the Unspeakable King preserved order in his silent cities. These empires were not chaotic. They were efficient. Efficient in cruelty. Efficient in war. Efficient in their survival. And they warred. Constantly. Terra became a planet-wide battlefield, not the theatrical wars of modernity, but the brutal grinding conflicts of desperation, fought over water, energy, and clean soil, a war for every nutrient, every drop of coolant, every gene seed fragment. Whole generations knew nothing but battle. Children raised rifles before they could walk. Cities changed hands so often that no one remembered their original names. In the deepest wastes of old Terra, titanic machines of war clashed, reawakened titans, long dormant, now reprogrammed by whatever mind could crack their vaults. And still more warlords rose, claiming control of isolated regions with armies made from techno-barbarian hordes, scavenger tribes, or psychic cults. But beneath the blood and ash, Terra lived. It refused to die. Not because it was strong, but because it was familiar with ruin. The planet had been broken before, burned, starved, mutated, even forgotten. But never, not once, did it surrender. And so, within the shadows of the tyrants, something else stirred. Quiet at first, hidden. He had no title then, no golden throne, no soldiers, just vision. The man who would become the emperor watched. He studied Caligan, Doom, the Fire Kings. He learned their strengths, their weaknesses. He measured their empires, not in numbers, but in ideas. He let them rule, let them war, let them exhaust themselves, and when the time was right, he would unmake them. Not out of vengeance, but because the stars demanded it. Terra had suffered enough. It was no longer a world of tyrants. It would become a world of destiny. And those who had fed on its bones would soon taste a new kind of fire. Unity. And from that unity, a storm far greater than the Age of Strife would rise. They called them wars, but they were not wars as we understand them. They were not measured in territory gained or banners raised, nor in victory parades or treaties signed. They were measured in what survived. And often, that was nothing. The wars of old Earth were not singular conflicts, but 1,000 overlapping agonies, a crucible of blood and dust that consumed the ruins of humanity's homeworld and forged something new in the ashes. After the fall of Unity, after the warp storm sealed Terra from the stars, the planet did not fall into peaceful decay. It clawed at itself. Every inch of soil became contested. Every surviving vault, reservoir, energy source, or gene forge was hoarded by those powerful enough to hold it and ruthless enough to keep it. It was the war of all against all. What began as local resource struggles spiraled into a planetary catastrophe of endless escalation. The surviving cities had become armed fortresses, their leaders, warlords, and petty emperors. The atmosphere thickened with smoke, nuclear soot, and radiation storms. The land itself began to shift. Ruined orbital impacts and tectonic weaponry shattered coastlines. Mountains were reshaped by macro-cannon bombardments. The old maps meant nothing. There were no front lines. There was only the churn, the endless grinding churn of violence. Some conflicts lasted weeks, others raged for centuries. Entire generations were born and died in subterranean trenches or hive spires under siege. Children were drafted before they learned to speak. The elderly were recycled into protein paste. Technology became myth, and myth became law. The Pan-Pacific War Front, once a region of luminous spires and underwater arcologies, became a shattered archipelago of acid rain ruins and irradiated swamps. Its warlords bred monstrous infantry, human only in shape, genetically tweaked for bone density, aggression, and organ redundancy. They fought in roving death swarms, eating as they advanced, devouring both enemy and ally to sustain themselves. Against them stood the steel confessor states, remnants of ancient forge enclaves who had turned their faith to the machine entirely. Their warriors were not born, but built. Flesh was a flaw. Their doctrine demanded purity through chrome and voltage. They fought in silence, marching across the ash wastes in exo-rigs powered by cracked fusion cores, their faces hidden behind vox masks that whispered hymns in binary. The war between them lasted 98 years. No one remembers who started it. No one remembers who won. On the high plains of what was once Eurasia, a three-way battle raged between the Red Helix tribes, the Germani Cytogilds, and the Albion Iron Kings. These were more than territorial disputes. They were ideological wars, conflicts over what humanity should become. The Red Helix believed in flesh, in mutation, in the sacred power of uncontrolled evolution. They embraced change. Their warriors fought naked but for ritual scars and chemical enhancers. Their blood could melt armor. Their eyes glowed in the dark. They believed they were the next step. The Cytogilds, by contrast, clung to order, surgical, exacting, cold. Every citizen was coded at birth. Individuality was weakness. Their soldiers were cloned in sterile vaults and implanted with memory cores of ancient tacticians. They moved like machines, killed without hesitation, died without regret. And the Iron Kings, they remembered terror. They remembered names like Ursh and Marika, and they hated them. The Iron Kings swore that no tyrant would ever again rule over all. Their armies were ragged but unbreakable, armored in salvaged Titan plating, wielding weapons forged from broken orbital debris. They sang as they fought. They dug in. For over a century, these three powers fought across the shattered plains and radioactive forests. Fortresses rose and fell, cities were bombed into glass, the skies filled with zeppelins stitched from hive cloth, gunships running on scavenged reactor cells, and storm clouds seeded with neurotoxin. The dead were buried where they fell, if they were buried at all. It wasn't just war. It was memory eating itself. The relics of the old age made it worse. Beneath the ground, in the forgotten catacombs of the dark age of technology, caches still pulsed with power, reactors that had not dimmed in 10,000 years, autoforges sealed behind adamantium blast doors, AI fragments, weaponized archaeotech, whole sub-realities contained within stasis crypts. Whoever found them became gods, if they could survive them. On the ruins of Mount Olymparia, an ancient war satellite fell from orbit, crashing into the zone known only as the Scablands. The blast radius consumed 3 armies, but those who scavenged its remains found a gravity warp cannon still functional. It changed the course of the next 40 years of war in that sector, until it destabilized and collapsed an entire mountain range into itself, burying both allies and enemies under a sea of glass and molten iron. Other relics were darker. In the vaults of Deimos, hidden in a ruined data core silo, a warlord known as the Eater King found something. No record remains of what it was, but when he emerged, his eyes were gone, his skin translucent, and his words caused men to bleed from the ears. His army did not march. It swayed. They didn't speak. They hummed. He conquered 20 hive stacks in 9 days. On the 10th, he simply vanished. All that remained was a spiral etched into the foundations of the last hive, glowing faintly with warp light. And above it all, watching, moved one who did not call himself Emperor. Yet, he walked among the ruins, clad in anonymity, shielded by psychic wards. He wandered through blood-soaked battlefields and corpse-filled gutters. He studied the tyrants. He watched their armies clash. He catalogued the weapons, the errors, the excesses. He watched the dreams die. He waited, not for victory, but for clarity, because he knew something the rest did not, that these wars, as senseless as they seemed, were cleansing the slate. All the false kings would destroy each other, all the flawed ideas would burn themselves out, all the borrowed strength would fail, and when the last blade dulled, the last shot fired, and the last tyrant collapsed beneath his own ambition, he would rise. He did not build in the light. He prepared in the dark. In hidden vaults beneath the Himalaysian mountains, he perfected his gene craft, designed new warriors, constructed the protocols for unity, not conquest, unification. But the wars had to run their course. Blood had to drown the soil. Only in the aftermath could something greater be born. The wars of old Earth had no victor. No banner flew above the wreckage. But their end marked the beginning of purpose, and in that void something stirred. Not a king, not a warlord, but a vision, a fire, a storm, and Terra, bloodied and blind, was finally ready to see it. Long before the banners of unity flew, before the thunder of gene-forged legions marched across the broken crust of Terra, he walked among us, not as a conqueror, not as a god, not yet, but as a shadow, a whisper, a presence behind the veil of ruin. In a world ruled by madness and tyrants, he was the one constant truth, the hidden emperor. No one knew his name. It was never spoken, not because it was forbidden, but because no tongue was worthy of it. Even now, across 10,000 years, we only know him by the title he would later earn, the title that defines all things, Emperor of Mankind. But in the age of the Long Night, he wore no crown. He did not rule. He prepared. When others sought thrones built on the bones of the dying, he walked the back alleys of war-torn hives. When others hoarded weaponry, he gathered knowledge. When tyrants screamed of dominion, he said nothing. And when kings fell, he did not mourn. He simply waited. For this was not his first age, not his first ruin, not his first death. He had been there at the dawn. He had watched empires rise and fall long before the Age of Strife, long before terror had cities, long before language shaped breath. A perpetual, ageless, deathless enduring, born of a time lost even to myth. Across millennia, he had hidden in plain sight, guiding, nudging, correcting. At times he had ruled quietly, at others he had disappeared entirely. But always he had waited for this moment. The Age of Strife was not a failure, it was a test. Humanity had to be broken to understand what unity meant. The warp had to rage before it could be calmed. The tyrants had to rise and fall, to show the world what false power looked like, so that when the real thing arrived, no one would question it. He traveled in many guises, a wandering healer in the plague cities of the Pan-Pacific wastes, a silent engineer rebuilding reactors in the buried halls beneath Germany, a teacher in the frozen plains of Albia, where he taught the children of warlords the meaning of logic and restraint, a soldier in the service of a doomed cause not to win, but to learn how it was lost. He left no trail, no records, only ripples. Whole cults sprang up around him, unaware. The veil-binders of old America spoke of a man who could calm the warp with a glance. The flame saints of the Gobi wastes told of a stranger who walked into a warp storm and returned unchanged. The silent hand of Mount Narod called him the wordless teacher, said he showed them how to build fire from frost. Everywhere he went, change followed, not fire, not slaughter, but change. He healed the broken. He fixed the failing. He whispered truths to those who would listen and walked away before the light of those truths could blind them. But in secret, beneath the Himalayan mountains, he built his future. The caverns stretched for miles, vaults carved into stone with precision no tool could match. Deep beneath the ice and rock, beneath the ancient temples and nuclear scars of the old earth, he forged the last true bastion of human knowledge, a fortress of science and purpose, the Imperial Palace, though no one yet called it that. There he rekindled lost technologies, not the erratic, half-functioning wrecks wielded by the tyrants of Terra, but true relics of the Dark Age, purified and understood. There he created the first custodians, not yet golden, not yet famed, but warriors of absolute loyalty. His first shield forged in secrecy. And it was there he began the Primarch Project. No one alive then could have understood what he was creating. Not weapons, not soldiers, legends. Each Primarch was designed to be a paragon, not just in strength, but in mind, spirit, and command. 20 sons, not of flesh, but of purpose, each engineered with aspects of the Emperor's own perfected genome, designed to carry his will to the stars. But something went wrong. Or perhaps, as with all things he touched, something went right in the wrong way. The warp took them. Some said it was sabotage, an unseen hand from beyond the veil, reaching through the labyrinthine channels of time and possibility to scatter his work. Others said it was his own doing, his final test to see if his sons, thrown into the chaos of a broken galaxy, could survive. They were torn from Terra, cast to the stars like seeds in a storm. The project was lost, but not the dream. From the gene seed templates left behind, he crafted a new weapon, the Legiones Astartes, Space Marines. They were not sons, they were soldiers, engineered with the strengths of the lost Primarchs, each legion patterned after the traits of its absent father. In time they would find those fathers, but not yet. For now the Emperor had other work. The tyrants still ruled, the warlords still marched, and Terra, broken and bleeding, still did not know who watched from the shadows. But the time of silence was ending. He had allowed the world to burn. He had watched every system of false power collapse. He had counted every war, every failure, every desperate grasp for salvation. Now the foundations were clear. Now he would rise, and he would not rise as a warlord, not as a savior, not as a god, but as the Emperor. No longer hidden, no longer silent. He had studied the enemy. He had built the tools. He had shaped the future beneath their very feet, and when he emerged, when his armies walked for the first time golden and godlike, their thunder echoing across the plains, the people of Terra did not resist. They recognized him, even if they didn't know how, because when truth stands tall, lies wither. And when the hidden Emperor revealed himself, the world remembered what it meant to kneel. They were never meant to endure. Before the Space Marines, before the Legiones Astartes carved the stars clean of resistance, there were the Thunder Warriors, the Emperor's first sons of war. Not brothers like the Primarchs would one day forge, but tools of terrible precision. Tools he would use to break the back of Terra, to silence the last screams of the tyrants, and to burn the disease from humanity's cradle once and for all. They were not perfect. They were not supposed to be. In the deepest vaults beneath the Himalayan mountains, where the hidden Emperor had labored in silence for centuries, the gene labs hissed with steam and purpose. The long night had not yet lifted, but the dawn was stirring. The Emperor did not raise banners. He did not yet shout war. Instead, he created thunder. Each Thunder Warrior was a mountain of flesh and metal, genetically sculpted, engineered for war and nothing else. They were larger than men, towering, their musculature dense and brutal. Their skin was thick, often scarred from growth accelerants. Their eyes glowed with chemical fire. Their brains laced with kill impulse and obedience triggers. They were fast, violent, absolute, but they were not stable. The genetic treatments that shaped them were crude by later standards. Their lifespans were short, measured in years, sometimes months. They aged rapidly, their bodies deteriorated, their minds frayed, worn down by the horrors they committed and the brutal cocktail of biochemistry used to sustain them. Some went mad in battle. Some simply dropped dead in their sleep. Their systems burned out like overcharged engines. And yet, they were necessary. Terra was still not his. The warlords of old Earth still clung to their kingdoms. Their armies still roamed the wastes. And so, the Emperor unleashed the Thunder Warriors. Their arrival was not heralded by drums or parades. It was marked by silence, the silence of enemies too stunned to scream. When they struck, it was like the coming of a new element. Cities fell in hours. Entire regions were subjugated within days. The first major campaign was against Ursh, the greatest empire left on Terra, and the bastion of Caligan, whose tyranny stretched from the shores of Gyptus to the eastern steppes of ancient Asia. Caligan was no fool. He had psychers, armored battalions, war mutants, and war machines built from the carcasses of old night. But Caligan had never faced thunder. The Emperor's assault was swift. The Thunder Warriors struck like a tidal wave of steel and fire. clad in crude but nearly indestructible power armor, wielding weapons that belched plasma and explosive death. They tore through the outer provinces like fire through dry grass. Callaghan's generals tried to flank them. They were buried. His psychers tried to unravel them. They were silenced by the Emperor himself. And then came the siege of Uralan, Callaghan's capital, a fortress built into the bones of an orbital cannon, buried under miles of rock, and defended by techno-sorcerers and radnites bred for subterranean war. The Thunder Warriors fought in tunnels lit only by the screams of the dying. Their strength was overwhelming, their rage unchecked. They did not pause. They did not rest. They fought until they fell, and those who fell often stood up again to fight once more, held together by stimulants and spite. In the end, Callaghan died at the Emperor's feet. Some say he challenged the Emperor to a duel. Others say he was torn apart by the Thunder Warriors before he could utter a word. The truth matters little. Ursh was dead. The world felt it. But there were still more wars to fight. The Thunder Warriors turned west, crushing the remains of the American technocracies. In the irradiated wastes of Indonesic bloc, they fought armies mutated by nuclear exposure and biomechanical grafts. The Thunder Warriors did not flinch. They did not care. They waded through the sludge and fire, and they conquered. Everywhere they went, resistance fell. Not because they inspired hope, but because they terrified. The people of Terra did not rise to greet them with flowers or cheers. They watched from shadows, trembling. These were not heroes. These were gods of death, come to punish the world for forgetting its purpose. And always, at their head, the Emperor. Tall, silent, impossibly powerful. He walked through battlefields untouched, his armor glinting like the sun behind a thundercloud. His sword was never drawn in haste, but when it moved, the war ended. Men laid down their arms simply by meeting his gaze. Others knelt without knowing why. With the Thunder Warriors at his back, the Emperor achieved the unthinkable. Terra was unified, the tyrants were gone, the warlords broken, the fires of madness smothered, and in their place rose something new. Not a kingdom, not an empire, but the seed of Imperium. And yet, even as peace descended, the Thunder Warriors remained. That was the problem. They had been forged for war, nothing more. Their minds had been programmed for combat, their bodies unsustainable. They were killers, and peace has no place for killers. The Emperor knew it. Perhaps they knew it too. Whispers abound of their end. Some say they were honored, retired in dignity, allowed to fade away in remote sanctuaries beneath the palace. Others say they were slaughtered, betrayed, gunned down by the first custodians or the earliest Astartes, culled for the sake of the future. One tale speaks of the Mount Ararat massacre, where the last of the Thunder Warriors were sent to die against a phantom threat. No enemy, no resistance, just death. Silent, ordered. Their corpses were buried in unmarked graves, their names erased, but not forgotten. Because without them there would have been no Terra to unify, no base from which to launch the Great Crusade, no Imperium. The Thunder Warriors were not saints. They were sacrifice, a first step made in blood, so others could walk further. And sometimes, when the warp quiets, when the wind sweeps across the wastelands of ancient battlefields, one might hear the echoes, the thud of heavy footfalls, the rasp of a broken respirator, the rage of a god born to die, thunder, still rolling, long after the storm has passed. It began not with a trumpet, nor a great proclamation, but with the soft crunch of booted feet across ash. The last tyrants had not yet fallen, and still their armies roamed the dead cities and poisoned valleys, holding on to false thrones carved from bone and rust. But the thunder had ended. The storms of war that had shaken the bones of Terra for centuries now moved in a different rhythm. Something had changed. Something absolute had arrived. The Emperor no longer hid. He walked in the open now, radiant in bronze-gold armor, eyes lit with purpose beyond understanding. His silence had become command. His will had become law. His banners, once absent, now hung from the gutted towers of Ursh, from the shattered ziggurats of Marika, from the broken altars of the Fire Kings. Across a planet scarred by millennia of madness, a new symbol took root. The double-headed eagle, one head gazing forward into destiny, the other backward into judgment. It was not conquest, it was unification, and it was not gentle. The Emperor's forces, the remnants of the Thunder Warriors, the freshly minted custodians, the earliest of the Astartes, descended upon the warlords who still dared resist. Some were broken in open battle, their cities reduced to slag, their armies scattered like insects before fire. Others surrendered the moment they saw him, falling to their knees with tears and awe, hoping to be spared. Most were not, because mercy was not what the unification wars were built upon. Mercy is the privilege of a world at peace. This was not peace. This was surgery. A dying world had to be cut open, purged of its infection, and rebuilt cell by cell. The unification wars lasted for decades, but their outcome was never in question. Even at the start, the Emperor's dominion grew like wildfire. Every victory brought more minds, more warriors, more technology under his banner. Each subdued city became a forge, each conquered army a resource. The momentum of his vision consumed all in its path. But not all submission was bought by force. There were those who joined him, who saw in his rise the hope of a future not written in blood and rot. The scientists of the Germani core states bent the knee willingly, offering their databanks and surviving cogitators in exchange for sanctuary. The Albionic techno-tribes, fiercely independent and unyielding, recognized in the Emperor a warrior beyond their imagining. They swore oaths in the old tongue, binding themselves not by fear, but by respect. In return, he elevated them, not to glory, but to purpose. The Emperor gave back to the world what it had long forgotten: structure. Clean water systems, standardized data protocols, unified calendars. He reactivated weather control stations, restored orbital satellites, and rekindled solar mirrors to bring daylight to the deepest urban craters. Where once only ash rained from the sky, crops now grew. Engineered hybrids resistant to radiation, fed by filtered hydroponics. But this was not just logistics, it was ideology. The Emperor had not risen to return mankind to its past. He had come to forge its future. The imperial truth was born. No gods, no superstition, no blind faith in unseen spirits or whispered promises. Man would worship nothing but himself. Reason, logic, advancement, these were the pillars of the new age. The warp was to be understood, not feared. Psychers were to be trained, not burned. The stars were not the domain of myth, but the birthright of humanity. Those who refused this truth were given a choice, compliance or extinction, and many chose extinction. One by one, the final bastions of resistance fell. In the burning ruins of Bahadrashan, a war priest tried to summon fire from the heavens. The Emperor silenced him with a glance. In the vault cities of Shannara, a rogue technocrat released ancient defense drones in desperation. The custodians disassembled them in minutes. In the swamps of Sahark, a cult known as the Worm Fathers declared that Terra belonged to the old gods of blood and hunger. The Astartes cleansed their shrines with promethium and bolter fire. Nothing remained. With every defeat, the people learned. They learned that resistance was futile. But more importantly, they learned that obedience brought salvation. The Emperor did not enslave. He disciplined. Those who embraced unity were rewarded. Former warlords were allowed to serve in lesser roles, their knowledge repurposed for administration. Engineers were reinstated, educators rearmed with fact over myth. Ancient universities were reopened under imperial oversight. Entire generations were raised in this new order. They were taught to see the emperor not as a god, but as a guide. A mind greater than any before it, a being who carried the weight of all humanity on his shoulders and expected them to do the same. By the end of the unification, Terra was no longer a fractured world. It was a fortress, a proving ground, a beacon. Its skies, once choked with ash and warp-borne lightning, were cleared. Orbital defenses were rebuilt, the old shuttle ports reactivated, the void ships of the ancient age, long dormant, were salvaged, retrofitted, prepared. The Emperor did not rest. There were still 20 legions to perfect, still the Primarchs to find, still the stars to reclaim. But before that, he walked the surface of his home one last time, alone, without armor, without escort. He passed through the burnt forests of Gyptus, through the shattered libraries of Ursh, through the hollow ruins of once mighty hives. The people watched, never approaching. They knelt in the dust. They bowed without words. Because they knew. They did not see a warlord. They saw the end of the old world and the beginning of the new. Terra had been unified, not by hope, not by compromise, but by will. And now that will would rise into the heavens, because Terra was ready, and the great crusade was about to begin. In the pale sky of Terra, one star always glowed differently, small, rust-red, ancient. Mars, the red planet. Once the jewel of humanity's science and engineering, it had long since vanished beneath silence and storms. During the age of technology, Mars had been a cradle of innovation, a forge world without equal, its surface alive with industry. But by the time the unification of Terra was complete, the Martian sky no longer shone with promise. It burned with dogma. Mars had not fallen like Terra. It had transformed. Cut off from Earth by the warp storms of the long night, the once pragmatic engineers of Mars descended into a strange form of survival. Where Terra had fractured into tyrannies and tribal states, Mars had calcified. Its people became priests. Its machines became gods. The cult mechanicum was born, not out of malice or heresy, but from desperation. Without the ability to contact Terra, and with their vast engines falling into entropy, the Martians turned to ritual to preserve what they could not repair. Schematics were recited as scripture. Maintenance routines became holy rites. Data became dogma. And the Omnissiah, the machine god, was born as a symbol, a divine mind believed to dwell within all functioning technology. By the dawn of the 30th millennium, Mars had become a world of fire and faith. Great forges rose from the red sands like mountains. Hive cathedrals belched smoke into the thin air. Everything was steel and sacred oil, every circuit a relic, every servo skull a testament to devotion. The tech priests ruled through ritual, replacing their bodies piece by piece until their flesh was forgotten. Binary hymns echoed across the domes. Tech thralls labored beneath the whips of electro-priests. Artificial intelligences, once outlawed, now myth, were replaced by machine spirits, coaxed into life with incense and chanting. To the Terranai it was madness, to the Martian it was salvation. And they had endured. While Terra tore itself apart in endless war, Mars had survived. Fragmented, yes. Hollowed, yes. But unbroken. They maintained fleets, stockpiled weaponry, guarded arcane technology that had long since vanished from human knowledge. Their Skitarii legions, augmented warriors of chrome and blood, patrolled the wastes. Their knights, noble houses bonded to towering war machines, dueled for honor and scrap alike, and deep in the Noctis Labyrinthus, great secrets still stirred. The Emperor had always known Mars would be the key. Terra was the heart of mankind, but Mars was its hands. Without its forges there could be no crusade, no fleets, no Astartes, no future. But the Red Planet would not kneel easily. When the warp storms began to abate, the first signal from Terra to Mars in nearly 5,000 years was sent, not as a plea, but as a declaration. The Emperor did not ask for alliance. He offered purpose, a new golden age, a unification not of faiths, but of function. The Martians hesitated. Some among the Fabricator General's Council saw the Emperor as the Omnissiah incarnate, prophesied bringer of divine order. Others viewed him as a blasphemer, a Terran despot seeking to replace machine god with man god. Civil war simmered beneath the forge halls. The Fabricator General, Kelborhal, played both sides, buying time, calculating. And then came the envoy. The Emperor did not send an ambassador. He sent a fleet, not of conquest, but of revelation. Void ships unlike any the Martians had seen in millennia, sleek, golden, silent, their weapons powered down, their hulls unscarred by desperation. At their head, a figure clad in radiant gold and black, surrounded by custodians and emissaries of the newly unified Imperium. The envoy offered no threats, only truth. Mars would not be conquered. It would be welcomed, if it could accept the Emperor, not as a god, but as the pinnacle of human potential. If it could swear loyalty not to dogma, but to purpose. The debate shattered the Red Planet. The Mechanicum split in two. Those who believed, the electro-priests of Olympus Mons, the Axiarchs of Ryza, the Pharolex of Lucius, swore themselves to the Emperor. They declared him the Omnissiah made manifest, not a deity, but the perfection of all machine logic. A being not to be worshipped blindly, but followed in unity and understanding. Others refused. They called the Emperor a fraud, a warmonger, a Terran tyrant cloaked in forbidden science. The cult of the true spark rose in rebellion. In the radiation-blasted equatorial wastes, the red singularity fired on Imperial ships. Deep beneath the crust, forbidden AI cores, long buried and sealed, were reawakened and turned upon the Emperor's forces. The Red Planet burned. It was not a war of armies. It was a war of ideologies. The Martian schism spread like virus rust. Titans turned their guns upon their kin. Skitarii kill squads stalked Mechanicum enclaves. Priests of rival dogmas fought in data duels and real space alike. Temples were shattered, code libraries burned, servo constructs rampaged across domes that had not known violence in 1,000 years. And the Emperor watched. He did not intervene, for he knew that fire cleanses. Only the Mechanicum that survived the Crucible would be strong enough to forge the Imperium's war engine. Only faith tempered by function would endure the galaxy. When the last rebel forge fell, it was not to bombs or bullets, but to logic. The Fabricator General, pressured, threatened, outmaneuvered, declared the Emperor to be the Omnissiah, not because he believed, but because he understood. The Treaty of Mars was signed in binary. It was not a surrender. It was a merging. Mars would remain sovereign in function, its cult and customs respected, its forges autonomous. But it would serve the Imperium. Its factories would build for the Crusade. Its tech priests would aid the legions. Its secrets slowly would be shared. Thus was born the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the stars trembled. Because now the Emperor had not just warriors, he had industry. The forge worlds opened, the black ships were commissioned, the Astartes received their weapons, the legions their tanks. The Titan Legios bowed their steel heads, and Mars burned no longer. It forged, under black smoke and red sky, amid the rhythmic clang of hammers and the chanting of binary hymns. The red planet became the engine of mankind's resurgence, and the stars would soon feel the fury of what Terra and Mars had become, united, unstoppable, unbound. Long before the Age of Strife, Mars had been the beating industrial heart of humanity's interstellar empire. In the golden heights of the dark age of technology, it had forged the weapons of colonization, engineered the mines of artificial labor, and built the first god engines that could stride across the stars. But when the stars went silent and the warp boiled shut, Mars was stranded, cut off, forgotten, and dying beneath its iron sky. And in that crucible of red dust and isolation, the cult mechanicum was born. It did not erupt overnight. It evolved, cell by cell, belief by belief, forming not out of rebellion or heresy, but desperation, without terror, without guidance, without the living network of human civilization. The Martians did not have the luxury of comfort or clarity. They had only machines they could no longer repair, no longer fully comprehend. So they turned to ritual, to worship. Each flicker of a logic engine became an omen, each successful reactivation of a data core a sign of divine favor. The oldest cogitator cores, still humming deep within the substrata of Olympus Mons, were no longer treated as tools, but as sacred relics, holy beings slumbering in the bones of the world. And in time the Martians ceased to see a difference between spirit and system. The cult mechanicum took shape not as a rebellion against humanity, but as a preservation of it, as they understood it. They did not reject science, they enshrined it. They did not abandon knowledge, they canonized it. Schematics became scripture, data vaults became cathedrals. The machine itself became divine. The machine god, the Omnissiah, was not born from fiction but from necessity. It was the answer to the question every tech priest whispered in the dark: how can I maintain what I do not understand? And the answer was faith. This faith structured itself quickly. First came the tech adepts, scavenger scholars who learned to interpret ancient readouts and piece together fragmented code from broken logic chains. They wore red robes to mirror the rust of Mars, believing the color offered blessings of concealment from malevolent machine spirits. As their knowledge grew, so did their power. Over decades, they formed the first priesthood, the electro-priests, those who communicated with machine spirits through a mixture of code prayer and neural synchronization. Then came the magos, the high priests of the mechanicum, whose flesh was more machine than man. Each magos had walked the sacred path of augmentation, shedding weakness with every limb replaced, every eye traded for optics, every synapse rethreaded with copper and steel. They did not speak with their mouths, they transmitted their will. In the cathedrals of industry, the great forges of Lucius, the storm-sheltered hives of Metallica, the deep bunkers beneath Styges, the machine cult cemented itself. It was not just religion, it was order. Mars was dead in all but spirit. The atmosphere was thin, the soil sterile, the seas long since vaporized. The only life that endured was the life that bent to purpose. The machine was the only thing that still worked. And so the Martians reshaped themselves in its image. They began to spread across the solar system. The moons of Mars, Phobos, and Deimos became satellite forges, each dedicated to specialized production. The asteroid belt became a sacred mining ground. Expeditions were launched across the void, seeking lost vaults, derelict vessels, and ancient data cores from the Dark Age. Each discovery was celebrated with sacred chant and divine procession. And always at the center was Olympus Mons, the mountain forge, the holy spire, the seat of the fabricator general. This individual was not elected in the way we might understand it. They were calculated, the sum total of computational aptitude, doctrinal purity, technical achievement, and cybernetic perfection. The Fabricator General was less a man and more a node, a central mind that linked all others. Under the Fabricator General's rule, the cult mechanicum was solidified into a vast and complex hierarchy. Every Forge world adopted it. Every priest, from the lowest data adept to the highest archmagos, knew their place. Every action, every breath, every movement became part of the rite of function. They chanted binary hymns as they worked, synchronized their thoughts with cogitator arrays, and implanted memory reels loaded with sacred data litanies. Even the construction of a simple laser gun became a religious experience, each bolt tightened with a prayer, each calibration accompanied by invocation. Deviation was heresy, innovation, a double-edged word. In theory, the mechanicum valued discovery, but in practice they feared the new, for the new had caused the fall. The men of iron had once been new, and they had turned. Thus, it was safer to recover knowledge than create it, safer to seek the pure designs of the STC, those holy standard template constructs from the ancient past. And so the cult mechanicum became not a force of progress, but of preservation. Each world it touched became more than an outpost. It became a shrine. Entire Forge worlds were founded in its name. Forge moons, Forge satellites, even Forge asteroids. Mars was no longer a planet. It was a doctrine, a machine culture, and its warriors were no less terrifying. The Skitarii legions, the foot soldiers of the machine god, were bio-enhanced, data-linked hunters with rifles that sang in binary and eyes that saw heat and madness alike. Each had their memories stripped, their flesh augmented, their will subjugated to the forge they served. They were not heroes, they were protocol given form. The tech thralls, lobotomized slaves wired to machinery, used as living fuel. They chanted with shredded throats as they shoveled uranium into furnace guts. The cataphrons, iron striders, electro-priests, onagers, servitors, and battle automata, each a nightmare of chrome and sanctified violence, dispatched without emotion to dismantle anything that defied Mars' logic. And when the Emperor finally came, when the storms of the warp parted and Terra's voice reached Mars, the machine cult stood ready, not in weakness, but in faith. Some believed the Emperor to be the Omnissiah, the machine god's physical avatar. Others doubted, calculating alternate interpretations. But all agreed that the vision he offered, reunification, function, purpose, was aligned with the cult's own. They signed the Treaty of Mars not because they were conquered, but because they understood. The Imperium would need weapons, ships, engines of war, engines of thought, and only the Mechanicum could build them. So they joined, and from that fusion was born the Adeptus Mechanicus, keepers of the flame, priests of circuitry, lords of the forge, not imperial in name, but vital to the cause. They did not bow to the Emperor, they served alongside him, because in the cult Mechanicum, loyalty is not born from oaths, it is born from efficiency, and there is nothing more efficient than the divine calculus of Mars. The red planet had burned, but in the ashes the machine cult rose, steel in hand, code in heart, and the stars would be reforged. There is a moment in history, brief and blinding, when two great forces do not clash, but converge, when divergent paths formed in ignorance of one another intertwine and shape the future. Such was the meeting of the Emperor of mankind and the cult Mechanicum of Mars. Not a battle, not a conquest, but an accord written in the language of function, faith, and fire. The Emperor had seen it all coming. From his secret sanctums beneath the Himalayan mountains, he had charted not just the rise of Terra, but the rekindling of Mars. He had known, long before the warp storms lifted, that he would need more than warriors. The galaxy was broken. The Great Crusade would be a war of logistics as much as ideology. Without ships, there would be no stars. Without weapons, there would be no victories. Without Mars, there would be no Imperium. Mars, however, did not need Terra. Not as it once had, not anymore. The Mechanicum had survived in isolation for over 5,000 years. The forge fanes still burned. The Skitarii legions still marched. They had built their own faith, their own order, their own truth. A truth coded in binary hymns and ritualized computation. They revered the machine god, the Omnissiah, as the source of all knowledge, the divine intelligence hidden within the gears of all creation. And when word reached Mars of the Terran unification, of the emergence of the Emperor, of the Golden Fleets taking shape in low orbit, a question surged through the cogitator networks like an electric pulse. Was he the Omnissiah made flesh? The debate tore through the Mechanicum like a virus through wetware. The Martian priesthood, ancient and splintered, had no singular voice. Some saw the Emperor as blasphemy incarnate, an organic usurper daring to rewrite sacred code. Others saw him as the fulfillment of prophecy, the avatar of all computation, the living code, the one who had walked unseen during the Dark Age and now returned to realign the great equation of man and machine. Fabricator General Kelbor Hal, Supreme Lord of Mars, did not believe in divinity, but he believed in opportunity. He had studied the transmissions, the data, the Terran movements. He had seen what the Emperor had done on old Earth, how he had turned the fractured mess of Terra into a fortress world, how his armies marched in perfect formation, how his custodians burned like small suns. Kelbor Hal did not need faith, he needed alliance. And so, with the forging of the Treaty of Olympus, the Emperor and the Mechanicum created one of the most powerful partnerships in the history of mankind. The Mechanicum would recognize the authority of the Emperor over the human species. Mars would serve as the principal forge world of the Imperium, supplying ships, weapons, war machines, and knowledge. In return, the Emperor would respect the sovereignty of the Mechanicum's rights, allow the cult to continue its worship of the machine god, and leave the inner workings of Martian society untouched. On the surface, it was diplomacy. Beneath, it was a calculation. The Emperor knew the dangers of allowing a religion to flourish within the framework of his secular Imperium. He had crushed warp cults on Terra, silenced prophets in the ruins of old America, and outlawed superstition wherever it stirred. His imperial truth was clear. There were no gods, only science, knowledge, and the will to wield them. But Mars was essential. The Omnissiah myth was inconvenient, but the manufactorums were irreplaceable, so he allowed the Mechanicum their theology. He wore the mantle of omnitia, not with reverence but with utility. He gave them just enough miracles to sustain their faith, resurrecting ancient data cores, reactivating dormant titans, revealing STC fragments that no Magos had unlocked in centuries. He played the role, because he had already won the reality. Mars belonged to the Imperium now, not by conquest, but by function. And with that alliance, the Emperor turned to the stars. The full might of the Martian forges was unleashed. Orbitals once dark roared to life. Dry docks constructed ships of war by the thousands, each forged with hymns, each sealed with binary rites. The vast manufactorums of Lucius, Metallica, and Ryza thundered with the birth of bolters, power armor, plasma reactors, and titans. The Emperor's Space Marine legions, barely born, were armed and armored not by Terran hands, but by Martian doctrine. And Mars, too, changed. The Adeptus Mechanicus, still known then by its original name, the cult Mechanicum, sent emissaries into the growing Imperium. Tech priests, explorators, and magi joined the Crusade, carried aboard the great warships. They walked among the stars with the Emperor's legions, not as servants, but as partners. Every new world conquered by the Imperium was a prize not just for the warriors, but for the Mechanicum. They sought lost knowledge, STCS, forgotten vaults of the Dark Age, ancient databanks hidden in Xenos tombs, anything that might bring them closer to the divine schema of the Omnissiah. The Emperor watched it all unfold. He did not correct their faith. He did not tear it down, because he understood something critical, perhaps better than they did. The cult Mechanicum did not need to understand truth. They only needed to function in alignment with it. Let them call him God. Let them chant over the machine spirits and polish their auspexes with holy oils. So long as the ships launched, so long as the guns fired, so long as the Titans walked. But there were tensions. Some within the Emperor's court mistrusted the Mechanicum. Some within the Mechanicum despised the secularism of the imperial truth. Rogue magi conducted forbidden experiments. Mars sometimes held back data. And even in those early days, whispers of dark Mechanicum tendencies stirred beneath the crust. Yet still, the alliance held. Because the Emperor did not build a utopia, he built an Imperium. And in an Imperium, compromise is not weakness, it is engineering. Mars was the Imperium's forge, Terra was its throne. The Emperor and the Fabricator General walked separate paths, but in the end they walked together, and the galaxy would tremble beneath the combined thunder of flesh and steel. Because the Emperor did not just lead men, he commanded machines, and the Mechanicum, in all its rituals, incantations, and sacred fire, served him, even if they didn't always know why. It began in silence, beneath the black stone of the Himalayan mountains, where the light of old Earth never reached. There, in vaults colder than the void and deeper than ancient memory, the Emperor shaped his ultimate instrument, the Legiunis Astartes. Not myth, not miracle, but engineered destiny. He had already unified Terra. He had subdued the Red Planet. He had bound the Mechanicum to his cause and equipped his crusade with steel and fire. But it was not enough to possess ships or strategy or vision. The galaxy was still broken, its stars infested with Xenos, its human colonies regressed into madness, heresy, and horror. Mankind needed something more than soldiers. It needed legions, not mere armies of men, nor the flawed butchers that were the Thunder Warriors. What the Emperor now forged were not weapons of war alone, but symbols. Each legion a reflection of his will, designed not just to kill, but to remake the galaxy in his image. But before the Astartes could be born, the foundation had to be laid. The Primarch Project. Though the Primarchs had been lost, scattered across the stars by forces the Emperor would never name, never fully reveal, their genetic legacy remained. From the recovered templates, from the seed of those 20 divine sons, he extracted something priceless, potential. This was not simple cloning. The Emperor did not seek to recreate the Primarchs. He distilled their essence, isolated the traits that had made them gods among men: resilience, intellect, aggression, loyalty, adaptability. Each of the 20 legions was forged in the image of one lost son, each designed to mirror the Primarch they would one day be reunited with, though none knew when or where. And so the work began. The first gene seed strains were cultivated within the sanctums of the gene labs of Luna, under the watch of the Apothecarian and the Gene Rites. Cloning vats the size of cathedrals hissed with amniotic fluid. Infant warriors floated in nutrient-thick slurry, their bones reinforced with ceramite-threaded marrow, their hearts quadruple-chambered to endure vacuum and fury alike. Each Astartes was more than a man, more than flesh. He was crafted, his body modified with 19 organs, each one a key to a different kind of war. The os modula to strengthen bone, the biscopia to fuel superhuman muscle, the Laraman's organ to clot blood instantly, the omophagia to consume knowledge through flesh, the progenoid glands to ensure the future. They were implanted over years, layer upon layer, as the recruits, known as neophytes, were trained, conditioned, and shaped. Some did not survive, some went mad, but those who endured emerged as something wholly new. Space Marines. But even the greatest warrior is nothing without structure. And so the legions were born, not as disorganized hordes, but as meticulously defined engines of conquest. Each legion was numbered, each assigned a color, a heraldry, a command structure. From the start, they were distinct. The Eye Legion, stoic, secretive, draped in midnight blue. The Dark Angels. The Third, proud, elegant, sharp as a scalpel. The Emperor's Children. The V, wild, lightning fast, untamed, the White Scars. The X, silent, armored in iron, unbreakable. The Iron Hands. The 13th Orderly, methodical, shining in cobalt. The Ultramarines. The 17th, zealous, ablaze with righteous fury. The Word-Bearers. Each legion had been designed with a specific kind of warfare in mind: siege, stealth, rapid assault, planetary extermination, psychological domination. Their gene seed predisposed them to certain mentalities, their indoctrination, their rituals, their battlefield strategies, all fine-tuned by the Emperor himself. And they were massive. Unlike the later chapters born in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, these were true legions, numbering in the tens of thousands. Some, like the 13th and 16th, would grow to eclipse 100,000 Astartes, each one a war unto himself. They trained first on Terra. They fought in the ruins of warlord fortresses, in simulation chambers built to replicate Xenos strongholds in the depths of long-dead hive cities. There they tested their thunder, and when they had mastered every known enemy, the Emperor unleashed them. The first true campaigns were not to the stars, but to Sol. The solar system had to be cleansed. Though Terra and Mars had been secured, the moons and outlying worlds were still infested with techno-barbarians, pirate enclaves, AI remnants, and human abominations. These remnants had dug themselves deep into orbital vaults, asteroid sanctuaries, and sub-oceanic fortresses, convinced that the Age of Strife had crowned them lords of their own hollow empires. The legions corrected them. On Mercury, the 7th Legion raised the fire domes of the solar cults and shattered the last self-aware plasma forges. On the moons of Saturn, the 6th hunted gene horrors through frozen undercities, leaving only ash. On Ganymede, the 2nd Legion, whose records would one day be expunged, purged the last resistance from a fortress ship shaped like a skull, its corridors lined with mirrors and madness. By the end of the campaign, Sul was whole. The Emperor stood at the center of his home system, holding not just the cradle of humanity, but the hammer with which to reshape it. Yet forging the legions had not been without cost. For every 1,000 Astartes created, hundreds of neophytes had perished. The gene seed was potent, but not universally compatible. Recruitment had to be constant. Entire Terran populations were screened, their strongest offered ascension, the rest given lesser fates, labor, service, silence. Some called the legions unnatural, others divine. The Emperor called them necessary, because the stars were still full of enemies. And now, finally, he had an army that could meet them. Not men, not machines, not mutants, but Marines, each bearing his mark, each carrying a fragment of a lost Primarch, each clad in power armor, wielding weapons that spat death and thunder. They were the shield of humanity. They were the sword of the Emperor. They were the Legiones Astartes, and with them the Emperor would launch the Great Crusade, a war not for conquest, but for reclamation, for truth, for humanity. But before the stars burned bright with the fire of 1,000 battles, before the names Horus and Guilliman, Sanguinius and Perturabo, Lorgar and Dawn, before the heresy, before the ruin, there was only this, a single man in golden armor, standing at the edge of the Sol system, 100,000 warriors at his back, and the entire galaxy in his path. The legions were forged, and the stars had no idea what was coming. There is a moment in every empire's birth when silence ends, not in a whisper, but in a blade drawn across the stars. For the Imperium of man, that moment came not with parades, nor solemn oaths, nor the signing of decrees. It came when the first of the great Crusade fleets ignited their engines and vanished into the void, bearing banners etched with a double-headed eagle and the will of a god who would not call himself one. This was not expansion. This was reclamation. The galaxy had once belonged to mankind, and now it would again. After unifying Terra and binding Mars to his will, the Emperor of mankind stood poised on the edge of the abyss. The stars glittered above, cold and scattered with 1,000,000 lost sons and daughters. During the Age of Strife, humanity's once golden dominion had shattered into silence and savagery. Colony worlds, once thriving under solar mirrors and AI-administered order, had regressed to primitive ruin, or worse, subjugated by Xenos, consumed by warp storms, or fallen into techno-barbarism and insanity. But the Emperor had not forgotten them. He had spent lifetimes waiting for this moment, his legions now forged, his alliances secured, his vision crystallized. And so he stepped forward into the dark, not as a warlord seeking conquest, but as a father reclaiming his scattered children. Behind him marched the Legiones Astartes, 20 mighty forces of transhuman perfection, each bred from the gene essence of a lost son. The galaxy, vast and war-torn, would soon come to know a new kind of war, a war for unity. The Great Crusade began on the worlds closest to Sol. It was surgical at first, swift and efficient. The solar system, already pacified, became the launch pad, Luna, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn's moons refitted as shipyards, barracks, and listening posts. The early crusading fleets, known as expeditionary forces, launched in waves. Each was composed of Legion Astartes, Mechanicum support, human auxilia, remembrancers, scholars, astropaths, and envoys. Each fleet bore not only weapons, but civilization. Their first targets were the lost worlds of the Segmentum Solar. Chthoniya, a gutted mining world, near suicidal in its savagery, was pacified by the Lunar Wolves in days. Their assault was brutal, but measured. The Emperor took note. He saw leadership rise among the ranks, a figure, a son. Albion's Wrath, a rogue AI-controlled station, had turned into a fortress tomb where humans were little more than nutrient paste for cogitator logic growth. The Iron Hands dismantled it floor by floor, their cold precision matching the machine's logic, until nothing remained but scorched metal and silence. Arc Reach Secundus, where feral humans had interbred with Xeno's gene stock, producing grotesque hybrids with psychic gifts, fell to the word-bearers, who purged it with holy fire and scripture. These were not merely military victories, they were messages. To every world the Imperium reached, the same choice was offered, compliance or death. And so the galaxy trembled. Some worlds rejoiced. Isolated outposts that had preserved human culture welcomed the Emperor with weeping eyes and banners made from family heirlooms. Their planetary governors stepped aside. Their people saluted beneath new flags. Other worlds resisted, and resistance was answered with annihilation. The pacification of 63-19, later remembered in hushed tones, was one of the bloodiest early campaigns. The planet's ruling war caste had erected atom shields and warp-jamming towers to defy the Imperium. They executed the Emperor's envoys and broadcast their deaths as mockery. The response was swift. The Ultramarines and the Night Lords came together in a rare unity of purpose. The shields fell, the jammers silenced, and for 3 days the sky rained fire. The entire capital continent was reduced to a molten plain. The survivors were marched to re-education vaults. None ever spoke again. But for every world brought to heal, the Imperium grew stronger. New soldiers, new resources, lost knowledge reclaimed, STC fragments recovered. The Mechanicum pulsed with purpose, its forge worlds roaring with renewed production. The fleets swelled, the Astartes legions expanded. Each success birthed 100 more plans, 100 more targets. And behind every operation, the Emperor moved, not as a remote figurehead, but as a commander. He walked among his legions, personally overseeing campaigns. When he appeared on a battlefield, morale surged, enemies broke. His psychic presence alone could silence weak-minded foes. His armor shone like a second sun. His sword cut through lies, flesh, and even hope. His dream was not conquest. It was order. Each compliant world was brought into a new system of governance. Administrators were installed, remembrancers sent to record history, terraforming begun, education implemented, the imperial truth taught. That last point was critical. The imperial truth, the doctrine that there were no gods, no spirits, no divinity, only mankind, only logic. The Emperor made it law. On every world, temples were torn down, idols shattered, priests executed. Faith was replaced with reason. The Astartes enforced it with brutal clarity. The Mechanicum ignored it with careful indifference. But the people were caught in the whirlwind. For many it was liberation. For others, heresy. But there was no debate, only acceptance or annihilation. And still the crusade pushed outward. Thousands of worlds were brought into compliance within the 1st century. Some were barren, dead rocks filled with data vaults and ossified bones. Others were living paradises, untouched by the ravages of the long night. Still others were nightmares, infested with xenos, ruled by machines, or bent to dark powers beyond comprehension. Each was approached, each was judged, and each was decided. But not everything went according to plan. The warp, still unpredictable, sometimes swallowed fleets whole. Some legions returned decades later, having lived entire lifetimes in alternate realities. On one occasion, a Crusade force emerged from the Imperium after a standard week, but found themselves 10,000 years into the future on a desolate, cold planet where the stars had died. They left nothing behind, only a warning. There were other enemies. The Eldar, fractured and fading, struck from hidden webway portals. The orcs, savage and innumerable, rose again and again in waves of green fury. The Hrud, Rak Gol, Kinebrak, and a dozen other lesser-known Xenos empires clashed with the Imperium in short, brutal wars. Each time the Emperor's vision endured, and slowly word spread. A golden man had come, a man who spoke with the voice of destiny. A man whose armies did not falter, a man who offered salvation and punishment in equal measure. And then, the first signs came. The Primarchs. One by one, across shattered systems and lost planets, his sons began to return. Drawn by unknown gravity, called by blood, fate, or the psychic hum of their origin. Each world where a Primarch was found became a turning point, but that was still to come. For now the galaxy burned, not in destruction but in renewal. The dawn of the Great Crusade had begun, and the Emperor did not look back. The stars still trembled from it. Though the Age of Strife had ended, though the warp storms had begun to calm, though the Emperor's banners now pierced the void in every direction, the galaxy remained scarred. Beneath every world reclaimed, behind every vault unearthed, inside every silence too long sustained, the past lingered like a toxin in the bloodstream of humanity. It had a name, Old Night. It was not a war, though it had spawned many. It was not a single event, though it had shattered millennia. Old Night was absence, of unity, of light, of reason. It was the black void that swallowed the Golden Age whole, leaving only ruin and ruin's children. And while the Emperor's great crusade brought light, it also stirred shadows that had long forgotten how to hide. The deeper the Imperium pushed into the void, the more they uncovered the true cost of the long night. On some worlds it was visible in the bones. In the lamented ruins of Calix Fortuna, towering skeletons littered the plains, giant humanoid constructs made from bone, steel, and obsidian, each seated upon thrones carved from petrified muscle. The Word-bearers found them first. They believed them ancient bio-titans, used in wars now lost to any record. But what disturbed even them was this. Each skull was smiling, each hand clutching another, as if they had died laughing. On Jorve, the population had devolved to primitive animalistic tribes, but in the sky above, orbital habitats still floated. Entire cities in the void, pristine and automated, empty save for the humming of machines that had served no one in 10,000 years. The Dark Angels breached one. What they found was haunting. Portraits, names, family lines, all still maintained in digital glass, all untouched, waiting for people long since turned to dust. Then there were the vaults. The vaults of Jaracel, buried under kilometers of ice, contained not treasure but records, databanks of entire lost civilizations, each planet's rise and fall encoded in collapsing cogitator banks. One entry told of a world that detonated its own sun to avoid being taken by a silicon-based parasitic species from beyond the galactic rim. Another, simply labeled Narthak's Protocol, was a log of pleas for aid from a world whose atmosphere was turning to crystal. No response was ever sent. These were not isolated anomalies. They were everywhere. On every world that had once flourished, Old Night had left its fingerprints. Dead men speaking in repeating data loops, monuments half-melted by unknown energies, children born with voices that echoed from the warp, mechanisms that activated only to scream. The tech priests of Mars were both awed and horrified. So much had been lost. Whole sectors of STC knowledge, entire libraries encoded in solar orbitals, were found corrupted, overwritten, or simply missing. Artificial intelligences, once restricted and feared, were discovered buried in quarantine, sentient, aware, insane. Some begged for death. Others demanded worship. Still others offered data in exchange for bodies. And through it all, one terrible truth became clear. Old Night had not simply broken humanity. It had reshaped it. The gene pool of mankind was no longer consistent. In isolation, humans had mutated, adapted, and evolved in wildly divergent ways. Some had become giants, evolving massive frames in high-gravity death worlds. Others had become hairless, pale, and eyeless, adapted to the eternal night of underground cavern hives. Some had developed minor psychic talents, while others could barely process language. Their minds regressed to instinct and fear. The Emperor's dream of unity now faced a hard question. What counted as human? On Bliss, a paradise world spared by warp storms, the populace had become genetically refined, augmented through ancient nanite rituals. They welcomed the Imperium with open arms, only to be declared abominable by Mechanicum Magi, who identified the nanite symbiosis as techno-heresy. The Emperor overruled the judgment. Bliss was spared. On Torghast 9, a world of beautiful crystalline cities, the people walked with grace and peace, but they possessed no capacity for violence, having been psychically conditioned over centuries. When the Night Lords demanded soldiers for the Crusade, the Torghasti refused, horrified at the thought. The punishment was absolute. The cities were turned to glass. Because unity, the Emperor believed, required sacrifice, even when it meant the erasure of a legacy. There were darker legacies, too. Remnants of the Men of Iron, the synthetic intelligences whose rebellion had shattered the Golden Age, were still found lurking in ancient battlefields, sealed in stasis tombs, buried under moons and deep within planetary cores. The 6th Legion found one such unit on Thermos, where a series of AI-controlled drones had kept a city functioning for millennia, raising generations of humans under surveillance, teaching them obedience to the machine. When the Imperium arrived, the drones did not resist. They asked for orders. The Emperor ordered them destroyed, not out of hate, but memory. He had seen what AI could become, what it had become. And worse still, there were signs that something else had walked beside man during Old Night. Something not born of flesh, machine, or Xenos origin. The warp. Across hundreds of worlds, traces of demonic influence still lingered, symbols carved into mountains that no man remembered, dreams that repeated across unconnected star systems, entire cultures built around whispers in the dark. The word-bearers recorded these phenomena in sacred silence. The librarians of the early legions, still permitted to practice their psychic arts, sensed the echoes of ancient pacts. The dark gods had spoken to man in the long night, and some had listened. The Emperor knew this better than anyone. He knew that Old Night had not just fractured the galaxy physically, it had cracked open the veil. The psychic awakening of mankind, the flood of uncontrolled psychers, the rise of cults, and the madness of isolation had allowed something else to bloom. The legacy of Old Night was not just dead worlds and broken machines. It was infection, in soul, in thought, in truth. And so the Crusade had to do more than reclaim. It had to cleanse. Entire cultures were erased, libraries burned not for heresy, but for what they remembered. Worlds were sterilized, psychers purged, populations resettled, myths rewritten. The truth of Old Night would be buried. In its place, the imperial truth. No gods, no demons, no past, only humanity. But some remembered, some whispered, some kept the old names alive in secret, dreaming of the fire that had once spoken in their blood. The ecclesiarchy did not yet exist. Chaos was not yet named, but its footsteps had already walked across 1,000,000 worlds. The Emperor could not kill the past, but he could bury it, with fire, with silence, with the shining banners of the legions. And as the great crusade thundered onward, system by system, light after darkness, he left behind not ruins, but order. And yet, beneath that order, beneath the brass and marble and regulation, the ashes of Old Night still smoldered, waiting, watching, knowing that all things in time return to shadow.